Okay. Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order, and this is the meeting of March the 20th, open session at 1 o'clock for the Imperial Irrigation District. And the first thing we're going to have is Jonathan Berkey from the Grace Lutheran Church in El Centro is going to do the prayer, and then please remain, he's going to do the flag salute. So everybody stand up, please.
Let us pray. Most gracious God in heaven, we do give thanks to you for the blessing of another day, the opportunity we have to come together to meet and to discuss the business at hand. We pray, Lord, that you would send your Holy Spirit to dwell among us, that there would be peace and there would be clarity of mind, that as we discuss the various business, that we would just seek to find peace and a peaceful resolution. Lord, we do give thanks to you each and every day for the opportunity you give us to praise your name. And as we do come in this meeting, may we honor you in our words and in our actions. This we pray through Christ Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen.
Amen.
And let us now salute the flag of America. We begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, we're going to see if Mr. Garvey, you have anything to report that was out of closed session?
Yesterday, yes, sir. The board took action to direct its real estate negotiators to negotiate a lease for a term of 50 months at a total cost of approximately $621,000 for approximately 11,000 square feet in the Valley Plaza building. There is no other action taken.
All right, thank you. Next item will be presentation, the Employee of the Month for April 2012, and then we're going to have service awards. So will the board please come down front?
This certificate of appreciation is presented to Donald Smedley for distinguished service that has resulted in his selection as Employee of the Month for April 2012. In the early morning hours of July 25, 2011, IID employee Edward Delente experienced anaphylactic shock from an allergic reaction to a bee sting he received upon his arrival at work that day. When Mr. Delente's EpiPens failed to work properly, Don Smedley, machinist metalsmith foreman, took swift action and drove him to the El Centro Regional Medical Center emergency room. According to the doctors and nursing staff, Mr. Delente's situation was so critical that waiting for paramedics to arrive was not the right choice. Mr. Delente was in the intensive care unit for 2 days and returned to the hospital twice with relapses due to complications. His family is very thankful for Mr. Smedley's quick thinking and level-headedness during this incident that resulted in saving a coworker's life. For his safe and swift actions resulting in saving Mr. Delente's life, the Imperial Irrigation District is proud to honor Donald Smedley as Employee of the Month for April 2012.
So do you have family with you? Have it come up. How are your family? Thank you. Thank you. Go back up there and.
Now for service awards, they all read the same except with the name and the years of service. Since this certificate of recognition and service pin replica of the district emblem are presented to, this one's presented to Stephen Birch for 20 years of loyal and faithful service of the Imperial Irrigation District. Come on up. For 35 years of service, Ronald Blankenship, Water Dispatcher 2 in the Water Department. And it's right there. And for 35 years of service, Emma Cordova, Clerical Tech in the Energy Department. Is there anyone else here to receive a service award and I didn't call your name? Okay, that ends our service awards.
Okay, thank you, and we're going to move on to the approval of the order and the agenda items.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, please vote. Thank you. We're going to move on to public comments, so you have 5 minutes, and state your name, and you have 5 minutes to speak. Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Oscar Gonzalez, Calexico. I want to thank Jim Hanks. Had it not been for Jim Hanks, we wouldn't have known how much we were paying IV Press. It's around $64,000 every year. I hope that you can share that with Sol del Valle is probably the best Spanish medium for the Mexican community. People in Calexico don't read Imperial Valley generally. Maybe the wannabe gringos read the IV Press, but not in Calexico. So I hope that you guys share some of that little money with Sol del Valle. At the same time, I want to thank Hanks, Matt Desert, Abadi's not here. And may he rest in peace, Orby Hanks, for giving me a lot of feedback, things that I should look at, critically analyze the adverse impact, any issue that's brought upon your agenda. I was the first one in Calexico in 1986 I was a campaign manager of Don Cox, and he won. No white man had ever won. And I told Louis, Gopher, Jack Ortega, and others I was going to make money, and he paid me handsomely. And Louis finally said, well, you've helped me all the time for nothing. It's about time. And ever since then, I've been helping people get elected. And I was there yesterday, and we saw the pretty woman from Brawley, Ms. Mendoza, with Jerry Grijalva and Hank Legaspi and Memo. Memo Nievas will tell you he's a BSer. He'll tell you the half of Calexico, but that's cool. We're going to win in Calexico big. Every day we're working. Unfortunately, his opponents are working valley-wide, and Oscar Gonzalez is working daily. I got home last night at 9 o'clock. We ordered all of his material, half of his materials in Mexicali, because Luis Castro has an uncle, and we went to his printing shop. Very, very cheap. But he's going to order the other half from Imperial Printers because he believes in sharing the thing, you know. And I think we're all a family here. All of us in this community, including Mexico, we're a community. IID represents our community. We're all a community, and we all want to do what's right. We all want to make more money. We all want our kids to go to good schools. We all want a good home. We want to have money to go, not to have a concubine, but we want money to enjoy the American dream. That's what we all want. I remember when somebody asked Cesar, Big Kevin, and there was a KK guy, and he told Cesar, hey, what do you want? How come you guys are protesting? And Cesar said, get a piece of paper and write down everything you want for your family. And he basically said Cesar said, that's what I want for my kids. And I think Mexican people deserve the same thing. Mexican people or poor people, there's a lot of poor people at Airport Circle, believe me. In Brawley, when I came here in 1975, this old guy pulled out a shotgun and said, you're not going to come into my property. I don't want to register. But I registered. I was one of a team. When I started from the bottom. And I got educated by Luis Legaspi, Campillo, Jack Ortega, Gopher, etc. But there was a lot of Caucasians that have helped me in here in Imperial Valley. Orby Hanks, Jim Hanks, Matt Desert, Abadi, you could go on. And Steve Benson, John Benson. I remember drinking beer when I was 28 at Louis Legaspi's gas station. And you know what? Some guy asked me the other day, how come you're always complaining? A lot of people hate you. I said, but a lot of people thank me that I speak for them. You told me that many times, Jim. Castro tells me the same thing. He's backing Steve Benson. And I'm telling you that the only thing I do is I see the IID like a sick uncle. I'm trying to cure it, you know. And I just don't do it for myself. I've never wanted to be rich, but I'm highly educated. All of my kids are educated. They all have masters. And I live in Calexico, and I have a home, and I have other homes. But I don't pretend to be something I'm not. I have always tried, and I fail miserably to be true to myself.
You got 20 seconds, Oscar.
Well, I cuss inadvertently, you know. My father cussed. But I'll tell you one thing. I came from a poor family, humble, hard workers. You can't find Enrique Gonzalez Alfaro more than a hard worker. Oscar Gonzalez, gracias.
Thank you, Oscar. Who's up next? Mark, how you doing?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mark McBroom, Calapat, President, Pearl County Farm Bureau. I'd like to read you a short letter, resolution from Pearl County Farm Bureau's last board meeting, and pass this copies to each director, if you would, please. Dear President Minville, the County of Imperial has recently approved multiple 30-year solar power projects temporarily removing farmland out of production for energy development. In addition, several similar projects projected on ag lands are up for consideration in the coming months. Although this is a land use issue under the County of Imperial's jurisdiction, the distribution of unused water as a result of this short-term reduction in the agricultural production falls under the IID's authority. In anticipation of the IID General Manager Kevin Kelly's report on the topic, the Imperial County Farm Bureau recently discussed this issue. In response, the Imperial County Farm Bureau's Board of Directors feels strongly enough to recommend to the IID Board of Directors that the water from industrial projects unused remain in the IID water pool for reasonable and beneficial use by the landowners and ag water users in Pearl County. Furthermore, Imperial County Farm Bureau requests that you also allow Attorney Charles Dumars to review this position and seriously consider his opinion before developing any new policy on the subject. And we want to thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to make, Rusty, you're up. How you doing, Rusty?
Rusty Jordan Brawley. Mr. Chairman, I had something that's, this last week the Supreme Court denied review of the QSA, some parts of the QSA that had come before it. And it appears to me there's a possibility that nobody really gives a darn about the IID. What they want is the water to the coast to save the Delta. And I don't know that you would buy that, but I would think that you could consider the idea that the QSA is going to be ratified in the courts no matter who opposes it, because they want it, and we really don't matter. Now, the problem for you is, I think your attorneys told you that the IID was protected for the Salton Sea when the deal was made. And they were supposed to put up the money, and now, but your own attorneys have very nobly argued and won that even though the state owes the money, they don't have to pay. So you might want to look at meeting of the minds, which is really the last substantive issue before the court. And you could go back, you can talk to the people that have been IID board members. Stella was on the board. You had Bruce Kuhn, Rudy Maldonado. Ask them. I don't think that they thought that no one was going to pay. I mean, that the state was going to pay. And I think that the $140 million or whatever the amount is in today, in 2003 dollars, will not cover fixing the sea. If you got up and said, we didn't have a meeting of the minds, if you instructed your attorneys to say that, there might be a chance, maybe, that the QSA wouldn't go through. Now, I did a quick review of Mr. DeMar's presentation, and he takes it from a different point of view, which is a valid one, which is basically that it's not going to work, and so somebody else is going to have to put up money. But one way or another, if you look at his approach, or this approach I was suggesting that you might think about, that it's going to have to be redone. And you might be better off having it redone without a contract that people are trying to enforce. Because my guess is that if you declared a breach and the state didn't want to put up the money, and San Diego didn't want to put up the money for the effect of the water leaving the Imperial Valley on the environment, that it would take you, they would all hire the same kind of lawyers you got now, and it would be years and millions of dollars to have the effect of a breach litigated. And because the state wants so badly that water to move, that it'll be very hard for you to enforce a breach. And so you just might want to consider the fact that, at least my observation is that the deck of the state court system is very prejudicial to getting the water moved. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else up for public comments? Steve, you're supposed to get in line over here behind the podium, Steve, so.
Over here?
Yeah.
Mine?
Yeah, it's usually when we line the speakers up, but I know you're different, so.
Okay, so it's like right here?
Yeah, right here. Now you can come to the mic, Steve.
Okay, I wasn't going to say anything, but Rusty started this meeting, the Minds thing. And one thing I'd like some clarification on, and I think I've talked to a couple of directors about it, that closed session meeting that Carter appears to have lied about in his declaration that was supposed to have happened, I think, October 5th to the 6th. Did anybody ever come up with any closed session meeting notice or on this meeting of the minds where the changes that were made after the original board meeting were ratified? Have we ever found the meeting notice or the record of a closed session that ratified those changes in this meeting of the minds subject?
I made a presentation to the board once about all the closed sessions that took place with regard to that issue. I'm sure I could pull that back out. I don't know which meeting you're talking about, but we know which closed sessions took place. They were all agendized, and we have a record of them. So I know which meetings took place.
Well, I mean, Mr. Carter made a very bold statement that was refuted by 3 board members that this meeting never occurred. So I'm talking about that meeting. I mean, we can sit here and play hide the peanut all day long, but I think you know which meeting I'm talking about. The meeting that Carter says in his declaration ratified the changes that Carter and Osias made after the board approved it. Approximately a time range. I think the verbiage in Carter's declaration was October 4th to the 6th. Do we have a closed session meeting where the changes to the QSA were ratified? I mean, it's a real simple question, Mr. Garber. And, you know, you guys want to smoke and mirror and confuse us as much as possible to keep us dumb farmers in the dark, but it's a real simple deal. Did that meeting occur that Carter referred to in his declaration that was refuted by Maldonado, Kuhn, and the Lloyd Allen letter?
I don't know how to answer your question. I've got a record of all the meetings.
Okay, so I guess I'll do a public
You don't have to.
information.
You don't even have to do that. I can make the presentation again. I made a presentation.
Well, why don't you
at
just
one
send
point.
it to us? We don't have to come to all these. I know you guys love to meet,
Because
but why don't you send it to me? You got my email.
Let me go pull what I have and see what it was. But I do recall
Okay.
making a presentation that was probably a year or two ago about all the meetings that took place. Now you can. I'm not putting any labels on what happened or what happened. I know what meetings
Well,
took place.
look, I'll do this for you. I'll send you the declarations, and where Carter said that there was this meeting, then I'll send you the declarations from Maldonado and Kuhn that say the meeting didn't happen, and then I'd like to see proof that that meeting either did or didn't happen. Okay, fair enough.
You can send me anything you want.
Well, okay, but will you respond? I guess is my question.
I don't know exactly what you want me to do. And
I want
so
you to prove that this meeting that Carter refers to in his declaration that is a pivotal point in this meeting of the mind subject really occurred or didn't occur. It's a real simple question.
Ask me what you want to ask me.
Okay,
Send
will
me,
do.
send me
Now-
what you want to send me.
Okay, Gloria, did we get all this? Because last time I spoke here and we talked about the grand jury manipulation that didn't make it into the original minutes. Is this one going to make it into the minutes?
We're filming it for you, Steve.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Wait do I exit?
What's it? Oh, you do whatever you want to do, Steve.
What's the proper
Well, it's up to you. Okay, anybody else? Out the door. No, they want you to leave, Steve. Anybody else want to speak? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to comments from board members. I'll start with Director Hanks.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a couple of comments. One, the last time Mr. DeMars was here, I thought we'd cut him a little short on the time that he needed, and I would appreciate if he has sufficient time. The water transfer issue is very important. We also have an item, number 6, which is the system impact. That is very important. It goes along with the MOU and the contracts that were passed recently. This is just one more of the components that needs to be scrutinized, along with the protection of the water against forfeiture that the Farm Bureau brought up. Also, water contracts have to be developed with the solar people. And then, again, the system impacts, that they are satisfactorily resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Desert.
Yeah, just wanted to welcome Mr. DeMars and his team here today. Also welcome all the audience today. It's nice to see a diverse representation from the Valley rather than primarily IID staff in the audience. In regards to Mr. Scaroni's comments, I've been sent these declarations and these documents also, and these attachments. I believe there's 6 in total, and I've been doing my own research on it, trying to get some answers, and I'm ready to move forward and make a little bit broader effort there, and try to get an item agendized here to take a look at the declarations and in the meeting that has been in question. So I'll be pursuing that and try to get something going there. And I'm available also for questions if anybody wants to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Director Mendoza?
No comment.
Okay, Director Sanchez?
Yeah, just make some comments on the court systems in California to some of the comments that were made here earlier. I think it's important that the district, as well as the board members, gauge California politics as well as national politics to get a better idea and understanding of where things might lead so that we can better defend ourselves against worst case scenarios. There's been scenarios where, for example, do the GM bondholders, should they get cut first or not? But we also have a case looking to Owens Valley where they were awarded the mitigation fees. So I think it's important that we do gauge politics and where it goes to best defend ourselves. But they seem to be leaning on both sides that it's tough to make a decision. And of course, the decision we make, we do with the best information that we have at the current time.
Thank you. Director Sanchez, my comments are I just thought they had a very successful energy summit last week at the Barworth Country Club. It was the 5th energy summit, and I thought there was a lot of excellent turnout and a lot of good networking dealing with renewable energies and Power to Renew California. So IBEDC put on an excellent event. And I know there was a lot of people who worked very hard to bring that together. And look forward to another one next year. Also, I'm glad to see Mr. DeMars here and your associates that have traveled all the way from New Mexico to make the presentation in a few minutes. So thank you for coming. And we'll move on to, I've got comments from the general manager.
No, sir.
And any comments from legal?
No, sir.
Thank you. We'll move on to consent. Is there a motion for the consent, or is any? Is that?
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor, please vote. Thank you. We're going to move right into the informational and executive, and that deals with Mr. DeMars. It's on page 33 of the agenda, and there's been a handout. There's a 34-page handout that was available to the public, and Mr. DeMars, we're going to let you take it over. And Mr. DeMars, you will have ample time to make your presentation. The board may have questions. Water department may ask some questions, and then we'll allow the public to have questions.
Mr. DeMars?
Thank you very much.
Real quick, in your 4th page, you say a final, more detailed and written report will follow.
Yes.
I'm guessing this is some difference in the first report you gave.
Yeah, this is different from the first report, what we're going to do today, and then we're going to have a final report which takes all these slides and incorporates them into a document that summarizes and explains the data behind everything in these slides.
Yeah, because I remember the first presentation I asked for the for data, so that we could see how you came up with, basically you have a proposal that you can critique. But you don't have a proposal yourself, so someone else can critique. And I think that's important when this board is trying to make a decision based on information and not philosophy. So.
Kelly?
Yes, President Minville, before Mr. DeMars begins, I just want the record to show that I requested that Mr. DeMars appear today. His written report, his sort of summary, isn't going to be completed until next month, and we'll certainly indulge whatever kind of time that the board and public feels is necessary.
Before you get started, I'd just like to follow up with a comment to Mr. Sanchez. Mr. Kelly, I gave you a list of assumptions and spreadsheets. Would you make sure that Mr. Sanchez gets those so he can understand that this is based on data, the reports that are being given?
Certainly.
At the beginning of the presentation, you have that there was no board involvement. Did you receive some of these assumptions by Mr. Hanks? It says here that no member of the IID board, staff, or the community attempted to influence the conclusions contained in this report.
No, excuse me. Those were produced by us. That's the data that supports, and they were provided to General Manager Kelly. I didn't receive anything from anyone or any input.
These are documents that were given to Mr. DeMars by IID CFO.
Yeah. The broking gave us some data. What, if I might proceed, it might clarify the issues, but
Yeah, do that, Mr. Morris, because the board of directors was not involved in anything that you did, and all your information came directly from IID staff and
Correct.
from Mr. Broken and his people, and that's how you came to your assumptions. So you're
That's
strictly
correct.
working off of IID information.
Right, let me just to explain what this is. As the general manager indicated, we're going to have a specific report that incorporates all the data that describes our findings in more detail. But we was asked by the general manager to put together information that give the public and the board a sense of what we're determining, and that's what this is. This is a summary of our findings followed by recommendations presented today. There will be a more detailed report that follows. First of all, just briefly, what our law firm is, who we are, and what we're doing here. We were contracted to provide an analysis. I'll describe it here in the scope of work in a moment. But we are a law firm that does basically environmental law, water law, hydrologic studies all over many of the states of the United States. The slide is in there to reflect that we have no clients in San Diego, none within the Metropolitan Water District, and no environmental clients in California that have any interest in the QSA whatsoever. Nor do we have any clients on the taking water out of the lower Colorado. So we have no personal stake in any way in these particular findings, and nor do any of our clients. This is what we were asked to do in our contract. We were asked to develop there was a contingency plan for IID that addresses the possible outcomes of the litigation in the Court of Appeals. The problem that was being faced was that it was possible that the Court of Appeals would rule that there was no obligation by the state to take care of to pay for the mitigation of effects on the Salton Sea. It also might cause various other effects on the enforceability of the QSA. So what we were instructed was to stay away from the legal issues in the case regarding the QSA and rather take a fresh look at the following items. They seem to be the ones that, looking at your past policies and reading all the documents of the board, there was a great interest in ensuring that there was a reasonable and beneficial use of the water that would withstand a challenge toward the IID of the water rights that they hold. There seemed to be consensus that the agriculture in the valley remains sustainable. There seemed to be consensus that there was the actual conservation of water without fallowing that was the intent of the QSA, that it was not to be a program that dried up the valley for the sake of sending water out of the valley to urban users. We also were asked to compare and look at the actual environmental costs to the region and how one might impose on those costs on everybody who receives a benefit. Finally, the question was asked, and this is right out of the resolution, is there sufficient money to pay for all the economic, environmental, and social costs? Just take a look at that in general. So that's what we did. We undertook to address the things that we were asked to evaluate. I was explained that the purpose of this is to basically provide our generic findings and provide recommendations, and to alert the board and the public as to the way in which we are beginning to see these things unpackaged. We think it's important that you not, frankly, that's been you'll find in our findings, one of our concerns in the past has been that there's been so much political pressure to move water out of the valley that sometimes there isn't sufficient public involvement, and that's not a part of the problem of the board's behavior. It's just the way in which tremendous pressures can cause decisions to be made and then made available. Our thinking was we are making some findings and making some recommendations. The board isn't going to just accept these. They're going to think about them and consider them. They'll look at the data, and they'll decide whether or not they deserve action. This is our methodology. We traveled to the Valley, met with IID staff on ecological, conservation, financial, and legal issues. Some IID staff traveled to our offices in New Mexico, where we went over all of the documents related to the conservation program, the definite plan report, the analysis of the air quality issues. We met with staff here on air quality. We evaluated all the environmental documents, the federal and state laws, and the decisions and the QSA obligations. In essence, we looked at the whole thing. And I'm first to say that this issue has started in 1984 with a horrific incorrect decision about whether or not the IID is a wasteful entity, and has proceeded forward. So there's a tremendous amount of history and a lot of feelings about who caused what and why is it this way. We didn't go into that. Our job was to look at where are we now? What are we supposed to do? What is our recommendation? What should be done now as compared to default, which is what's currently going on? We didn't go back and start trying to evaluate how things happened, although I've got a slide that I want to talk a little bit about the political way in which this occurred. But it's not a critique of what one could have done. It's here's where we are today. The California Supreme Court has denied certiorari. That's where we are. How are we going to, what's IID going to do with that fact? What about all the other pressures and what are the things that are going on? It's prospective. Just to make this clear, get it on the record, the staff made any document available to us we asked for. The accounting department, chief financial officer gave us all the data. We reconstructed using our own CPA and evaluated all of the financial data. We matched up the balance sheets with the expenditures, and we think we have a very good handle on the circumstances, the financial circumstances of the district, how the QSA money has been spent, how it's been disaggregated among various uses. We had very good conversations with everybody on the staff, but no board member tried to influence our outcome, and certainly and one interesting fact was not a single lawyer for the IID contacted us to provide us any information about this matter. But in a way, I understand it. We wanted to stay out of the legal arena and go to what can the board take ownership of, not what can lawyers advise the board to do. Those are two very different functions, so we stuck with the staff, and that's fine. Our report follows these four categories. First, legal and policy. Second, environmental. Third, the conservation program. And finally, financial. Within each category, we make findings and recommendations. And interestingly enough, one of our findings is that there have been too damn many recommendations. So we're kind of in a bind there, because there's too damn many smart people recommending things. Yeah, here we are. So these are our recommendations, but the recommendation is to consider doing things, not legal advice. But we will submit a very final, I think a substantial and very good written report. So the first category, and the one I'm going to speak to, is legal and policy. Patrick Redmond, who still barely has a voice from having a cold, is going to talk about environmental. He's an expert in that area. Stephen Curtis is going to discuss conservation and financial. And then I will summarize all of our recommendations at the end. We have a slide that does that. This is just my take. I guess my pet peeve is that, when I'm a water law professor, and every year in water law, it was kind of a coincidence. I would say, how much water does California contribute to the Colorado? The answer is very little. But California has 4.4 million acre feet under the Boulder Canyon Project Act, and they have at least 2.6 million under the Arizona versus California supplemental decision. And the Colorado River Compact allocates substantial amounts of water to the lower basin states. Why is that? That's because the pioneers in the Imperial Valley braved extraordinary risks and hardships to generate the water use and the production under farmland to get an entitlement under the prior appropriation doctrine. But for the Imperial Irrigation District, the allocation would have been much smaller. There would have been a junior priority for California. And so a great deal of basically acknowledgement of the valley, of the contributions of the Imperial Valley. It should be done. I don't think it has been done enough. The next slide is the next finding is that the present perfected rights, which are manifest in multiple law of the river documents, the beneficial use prior appropriation rights, are incredibly significant to this region. They are the heart of this board's function, and the board has worked really hard to protect them in every way. They've battled with the Bureau of Reclamation over time, but ultimately, there is this finding is that it is critical that the board step up and, as it has done in the past, continue to make sure those present perfected rights and the other rights getting up to 3.1 million acre feet, that those rights be protected at all cost. And it is because they are so valuable, and it is because the Imperial Irrigation District held that early priority, whereas the Metropolitan Water District in San Diego held junior priorities and others. It is just for that reason that in the mid-'80s, a concerted effort came to pass based upon the efforts of the Bureau of Reclamation, the urban centers in California, and the way in which you attract a prior appropriative water right. The way you do it is you simply say, it's not as large as you thought because you are being wasteful in your use of it. That's happened all over the western United States. And so there is this inherent tension between those who want to take the water from an irrigation and move it to urban use, and those who want to use it and want to use it reasonably and beneficially. It's just a natural tension. You've felt it over time. But I thought it was worth an independent finding to stress what everybody already knows. The politics of the river and the politics of California are incredibly powerful forces you're facing. This really makes that same point, that as far as our findings are that the Imperial Irrigation District is not a wasteful user of water and never has been. Rather, they both beneficially and reasonably use it under the circumstances and under the laws of California and under the law of the river. And our ongoing water conservation program efforts that we're going to describe will illustrate why there isn't waste going on here and hasn't been. The first and the case that bothers me the most is decision number 1600 out of the State of California Water Resources Control Board. Decision 1600 was the product of this will all be documented, but I think everybody realizes it was a product of forces of the United States Bureau of Reclamation, Metropolitan Water District, seeking to move water out of ag and over into urban uses, Metropolitan Water District in particular. Mr. Elmore participated in the case because his lands were being flooded. The net result was the conclusion that the action of the irrigation within IID that ultimately meant return flows were returning to their going into the sea, that the act of just running the water on the land and having tailwater go to the sea was a waste of water, and therefore the amount available to IID was substantially smaller, and the IID would be compelled to cut back its use or face the loss of the water rights under the doctrine of waste. That decision was we found that decision was wrong for two reasons. First of all, it is a reasonable and beneficial use of water to let return flows go to the Salton Sea because that's what's been ordered in the most recent decisions involving the QSA. In fact, you've got the State Water Resources Control Board directing that water go into the sea, the tailwater go into the sea. So for that reason, that decision is not correct. The IID it has never been a waste of water to allow water to flow into the Salton Sea. Furthermore, the court had an incorrect factual finding that the sea would stabilize despite the transfer of water from IID. And that turned out both of its findings were false, as a matter of fact, and in my view, politically driven. The result, as we know, was the conservation practice changes. MWD came in. MWD did all the work, put some good conservation mechanisms in place, got a substantial amount of water, but we're unable to discern where there was any obligation financially to offset the effects on the sea of the MWD transfer. Now, because if we are correct that the decision was incorrect because in hydrology, in administrative hearings, if somebody has a decision that's wrong on the facts, it can be reversed. You can go in and you can reverse that decision, and you can reverse it by asking the agency to change its position based upon the actual knowledge of the facts. So we believe that, in our view, our recommendation is that the IID should take a formal position that decision 1600 be reversed due to its demonstrably faulty factual premises with respect to waste by the IID. It is really important that we get that done, because if the IID was not wasteful in the first place, and if it's not causing injury to third parties to allow water to irrigation to take place without absolute conservation, then in my view, that becomes a linchpin to straightening out some other issues. But as long as that decision can be thrown up to the IID that actions were wasteful and that continued action would be wasteful, we're going to face that problem. So it's our recommendation. We do everything possible to reverse that decision. The next fact, and it's the one we were asked to look at, and it's a legal/policy decision. And we frame it this way. It doesn't really matter whether because the state of California is in a complete financial recession and cannot pay for the costs of mitigation and restoration, or if it's just a result of the decision in the Court of Appeals, that there was never the intent of the IID to actually hold the state of California to its obligation to take care of restoration and mitigation. We think it is, as the following presentation will demonstrate, you're exposed to extraordinary legal risk as the sea recedes if a major player doesn't ante up their part. A major player hasn't done that. So you don't throw up your hands and run away. You simply figure out how to fix that problem. So our finding is, just on the face of it, it just seems that the maximum effort should be put in. Once you evaluate the quantum of risk for the excess mitigation over the cap, you ought to distribute that among the partners to the QSA, and certainly if the failure to do the mitigation and the failure to get people to either come up, do the action themselves, and address it is anathema to this valley. The valleys that the district and the people who live here adjacent to the sea, all the communities will suffer as a result of declining sea level. So it just seems that our recommendation is you exert the maximum effort now to evaluate the risk, really understand it, and discuss this with all of the people who are benefiting from the actions involving the transfer. This one here is a little more sophisticated, but I think it's important to think about. We know that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation over the past 8 years has been incredibly forceful in demanding that the state of California reduce its use down to 4.4 million acre feet. We also know, for reasons we can't understand fully, that there seems to be an absolute unwillingness to focus on the Bay Delta area and the Central Valley Project and all of those areas where there might be some water to squeeze out to take up that deficit. And we know the net result has been to focus exclusively on IID and to, in many ways, ignore the Salton Sea. So there's tremendous pressure to get that, take that out of the IID, even if it affects the Salton Sea. That's I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. But there's another, so that's one federal agency on one side of the IID and the community, okay? And Patrick Redmond will explain this more. But on the other side, you've got the Federal Environmental Protection Agency saying, wait a minute, as that sea recedes, that's going to cause tremendous air quality problems. You're in a non-attainment zone, and you've got a federal agency telling the county and telling the entities that they could lose federal funds if they don't do something to mitigate, but you've got the state of California and the federal government not helping, so you're caught in a vice. That's a very serious one between two federal agencies. You need to address that. So I guess our recommendation is, if you acknowledge that's a correct fact as a matter of policy, then you need to start working with all the entities to illustrate the bind you're in and deal with work with the county and the other parties who are who fighting the EPA, and work together to try to address the tremendous pressure you're getting to keep fall within the 4.4 million acre feet. But that is a dilemma, that is a bind, that double bind you are in, that you need to face and need to confront. This is the last point. And this is arguing directly against just what I'm doing right now. But here's the point. In order for me to find the IID's policies about things, this has been my experience, okay? I have to look in legal briefs filed by lawyers to illustrate their positions. That is to say, it's nobody's fault, but this entire QSA and the entirety of the Bureau of Reclamation's pressure to squeeze water out of IID and of the Water Resources Board, it has been so full of litigation that when cases are in court, the real parties in interest, namely the board, the farmers, the environmental groups, they can't express themselves because they are caught by the litigation themselves. And the existence of litigation does have the effect of preventing access between and among the real parties. That's, in our finding, is that's happened here. You've got a lot of lawyers defending and suing, but the net result is that the real party in interest, the people in the audience and the board, can't communicate because they're on all sides of all this litigation. I consider that a problem. So my response to that is, based upon what we've done, if you find anything that we've put forward today useful, whether it involves water allocation, conservation, environmental mitigation, or the financial issues, it seems to be the board needs to step up and begin to develop policies. You've got some wonderful documents that you've produced about policies relating to water conservation and transfer, but I think you need much more direct competition or communication with other entities outside the litigation process. We need to figure out how to do that because the litigation shuts everybody's communication down. Okay, the next presentation will be environmental, and it'll then tie back, I hope, to the generic points I've made on the legal policy.
Thank you, Chuck.
We'll do them after. We can do all of them.
First of all, I want to apologize for the condition of my voice. Obviously, it's temporarily disappeared, but I will try to speak as lowly and clearly as possible. Just to pick up where Chuck left off, continuing one of the points that he made about being the whole process having sprung perhaps too much from theoretical positions, litigation positions, and not enough attention being paid to the practical end of things. My presentation is going to focus a lot on practical problems that are facing the IID currently and a practical way forward. So the first finding that we made was that there is a difference between theory and practice. Just like the definite plan presumed a complete conservation on a theoretical level, but the actual conservation implementation might vary from that theoretical level. Similarly, the QSA presumed that the state would cover the excess environmental mitigation costs, but since this will not occur in practice, the IID is bearing the risk of the state's default or potential default. Similarly, the problem is made worse by the faulty reasoning, the conclusion and the inferences of waste in the Water Board's decision 1600, the treating the flows to the Salton Sea as a waste of water. Now, the good news is that the current JPA and habitat conservation plan, habitat measures, air quality mitigation projects, they're bearing fruit. They're effective in becoming more cost efficient and less resource intensive. The Salton Sea has been on a downward elevation projection since the late 1990s or very early 2000s, partly because of the MWD water transfer, and partly because of conservation measures undertaken in response to BOR and Water Board mandates. The cost so far, the amount spent has been $39.5 million. A lot of that has been the mitigation water itself. I think it's up to about 200,000 acre feet of delivery so far. And $22 million has been spent on mitigation measures and projects such as the air quality pilot projects, monitoring. The managed marsh habitat is also a big part of that, and species surveys. Continuing on with this finding, we find that the rate of mitigation that's projected, or that's the sort of the routine level of mitigation, could be made more effective at an accelerated pace. The air quality pilot projects cover about 300 acres so far, and the actual mitigation is scheduled to begin in 2017 when the mitigation water program ends. But that could be accelerated under the petition for change, could be accelerated to start up in 2014. This is a list of current projects. There's sort of a nice synergy in prospect for years ahead between the state species conservation habitat project, which is just finishing up the environmental review process. There is also a bill before the Assembly right now to give more authority to the Salton Sea Authority to evaluate feasibility and effectiveness for restoration alternatives. And the JPA or IID habitat and air quality projects, they're being carefully designed to coordinate well with the state and other agency projects. The state, the SCH project, can also serve as a sort of proof of concept for the cost-effective, resource-effective habitat mitigation projects, and also a lot of projects can serve dual purposes. They can serve as habitat and as air quality mitigation, which is very important. The point is that as these things are being tested, they're becoming much more effective. So our second recommendation is to continue to work with the state and the federal natural resources agencies and the Salt and Sea Authority, especially if AB 939 passes, and with environmental experts to start thinking about ways that the pace of mitigation can be accelerated. Our third set of findings in this area is that there is a potential deficit of about $1.15 billion in the QSA environmental mitigation costs. This figure actually appears in some of the QSA books or the JPA books, and we think it's significant for two reasons. It reflects the extent of actual cost of mitigation, and it's an index for the potential IID risk in this area. And to show that it's not a far-fetched figure just pulled out of thin air, the similar experience of the LA Department of Water and Power dealing with the Owens Lake air quality mitigation, they claim that they have spent already $1 billion for actually less acreage than might be involved in the Salton Sea ply exposure, which could be around 40,000 acres. So our recommendation is that the board should indicate to the JPA partners that the anticipated cost of in excess of the $133 million QSA JPA cap should be allocated among the beneficiaries of the transfer, those who are benefiting from the water. Our fourth set of findings has to do with what Chuck referred to, which is the EPA pressure. Possibly the board is already aware that the Air Pollution Control District has been fighting a battle with EPA over the last decade over especially PM10 emissions. In 2004, Imperial County was declared in serious non-attainment for PM10 emissions. And this triggered a need for the district, the Air Pollution Control District, to submit fugitive dust rules and develop PACM, or best available control measures analyses. The Air Pollution District did submit these rules in 2009, and the EPA responded in 2010 with a limited disapproval, which is very important. What that limited disapproval triggered was a clock for imposition of sanctions. And so far, just recently, the EPA imposed level 1 sanctions requiring 2-for-1 offsets for PM10 emissions. 6 months after that, it's quite possible that the EPA will impose level 2 sanctions, which will withhold federal funding for infrastructure. They're called federal highway funds, but they can be used for a variety of infrastructure. It hasn't been threatened yet, but the EPA could potentially impose its own federal implementation plan if the Air District does not satisfy the EPA with its own fugitive dust rules. The key point is that due to this serious non-attainment designation, the Air District cannot allow an increase in PM10 dust emissions, regardless of the source. And this last part of the slide provides a quote from the EPA documents stating that the unpaved roads, open areas, and agricultural lands are significant source categories in the county. So this finding says basically that from a policy perspective, that the IID does share some interests with the county and with the Air Pollution Control District, although the IID is in an adversarial position with these entities regarding the CEQA and the NEPA aspects of the QSA validation case. So our recommendation in this area is that there needs to be some kind of recognition of these common interests and an attempt to cooperate with the county and the Air Pollution Control District to oppose any potential EPA sanctions or to take steps to avoid those sanctions. Now, our last set of findings here is that even though it was anticipated that the mitigation water program would continue until 2017, stopping the deliveries according to the petition for change in 2014 and applying resources acquired as a result of the petition for change could actually have a beneficial impact environmentally, because the mitigation water that's currently useful for delaying salton sea decline, is not preventing it, just delaying it, could be helpful for ramping up the necessary mitigation. And there has been modeling done that shows that although there would be an acceleration of playa exposure as a result of stopping the mitigation water, that by about 2030 the scenarios converge, and so the long-term state of the Salton Sea would not be different by ceasing the water deliveries three years earlier. So our recommendation is a general one here, which is that the IID develops a plan to achieve both the goals of maintaining sustainable agriculture and preventing unnecessary environmental costs to the region. And it needs to get some participation from the beneficiaries of the QSA water transfers to fund reasonable environmental measures. And now I'll pass it over to Steve with the conservation portion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I'm Stephen Curtis, a member of the Law and Resource Planning Associates and an attorney. These portions, the conservation and the financial, although I am presenting on it, were really the work of other people in addition to LRPA attorneys. And specifically with respect to conservation, we retained Dr. Phil King, a professor of agricultural engineering at New Mexico State University, who works with water districts all over the world, one of the larger ones in New Mexico in particular, and he has worked in projects in China and other countries as well. And he conducted a comprehensive review of the definite plan and all of its impedances, which is a impressive stack of paper, as well as the 2009 update reports to that. And we also had multiple meetings with staff, one in Albuquerque with Dr. Phil King, and also we came out together, Dr. Phil King and I, to the Imperial Valley to meet with the staff, to take a site tour, to talk through all of the conservation issues. So even though I am presenting these findings and had a help and hand in drafting them, they really are through his assistance. Oops. Okay, the first one is kind of the scary one, which is that the system and non-farm conservation approach that is laid out in the definite plan will be difficult if to achieve the savings ultimately required by the QSA. Less so in the earlier years, but the requirements ramp up rather quickly, and towards the end it will become difficult to achieve. Now, for reasons I'll start to explain, the fact that that's the case isn't a bad thing for the IID necessarily, but it is a fact that needs to be addressed. Here's how we arrived at this conclusion in summary, though again our report will contain more detail, but the targeted goal for the on-farm conservation in the definite plan is somewhere between 180 and 210,000 acre-feet per year savings at after the full ramp-out schedule. The actual per acre savings is at this point unknown, but even assuming a half acre foot per year of savings as being a realistic goal system-wide, and again it's going to depend on a whole host of factors, that assumption would require somewhere between, depending on the acres, the target that you select, somewhere between 76 and 89% of the acres in the farmable acres in the district participate at that level, at the level of half an acre foot per year. One of the several things complicate achieving that rather high participation rate. One is economics. Cropping patterns are not going to be determined by anything other than supply and demand, and the cropping patterns will affect total water use. Again, I would like to point out that this is not a bad thing. The fact that economics will determine the water use sort of helps to show that the water use by the Imperial Irrigation District and its farmers is not unreasonable if it's being driven by the markets. If this is what the markets are demanding, then that is what the markets are demanding. But it does present a problem for staff and for the IID in that the economics of what crops people choose and what level of risk, an additional factor, economic factor, is the level of risk that a farmer is going to be willing to assume of crop failure or crop yield reduction through the based on conservation will depend on economics. Will depend on how much they can reasonably anticipate in agricultural production. Those are factors outside the control of the IID, and that is what complicates compliance. Another complicating factor is, at least according to the annual report, it seems to be, the Water Department's annual reports, roughly 60% of any given year of the farm accounts are owned by tenant farmers, which causes a contracting issue when you're contracting with the landowner, and the payment benefits may run to the landowner, but it is the tenant farmer who is going to be affected by the decision to engage in conservation. And it's going to become more difficult over time, particularly as the effects of all these transfers start to be felt increasingly, particularly the decline on the Salton Sea, the exposed playa. You can expect more political opposition. This finding, number 2, kind of follows from the first one, in that since the success of the on-farm conservation program, which is voluntary, will depend on a great deal of factors outside the control of the IID, the QSA imposes an unreasonable risk on the IID that the proposed incentives will not trigger the type of conservation required by the agreement. And I've quoted from a couple of sections of the agreement, particularly the San Diego transfer agreement, where you effect a delivery simply by not taking the water from Imperial Dam, but it is an event of default, triggering specific performance as one option, as one remedy for you not to make the water available. Now, there is a section 12.4, which is in the section of the agreement allocating risks of various events, events of God, drought, that sort of thing amongst the parties. It talks about the possibility of modifying the agreement for a lesser amount, but that is only if an adverse determination results in a finding that less water is available for transfer. So I don't think that means simply that the incentive programs aren't working. So this recommendation follows from those 2 findings, and it's really, as I was saying, the fact that the incentive program for on-farm conservation may not yield the total amount necessary in the QSA isn't, at least from one point of view, not a bad thing. That is shown if you have engaged in a reasonable effort to induce on-farm conservation through incentives, but due to economic conditions outside the control of the IID that fails to produce the amount, that sort of shows that the amount at that level that is produced is the reasonable amount. That is, it is impossible to conclude that when reasonable in economic measures, efforts to produce on-farm conserved water fail to produce that water, that means it's impossible to conclude from that the IID is wasting water. Okay, next finding, and these are smaller in scope. These are, and you can expect greater detail in our written report regarding this, but the on-farm and I don't think this is telling Jesse Silva anything he doesn't already know deeply, but the on-farm conservation program success will depend in part on how the baseline against which the conservation is measured is determined. Under the proposals we have looked at, the baseline naturally will determine the amount of compensation for the reduced water usage. And you've got a tension here between what may be perceived as an equitable decision and what is an effective decision. And let me explain that a little. And a certain number of growers in this area have already installed conservation measures and are growing crops using less water already. And the question is, if we include as the baseline the amount that they are currently using in water, then they will sort of not get credit, I guess, for those prior conservation measures. However, under the QSA, as I previously indicated, your delivery is met by not taking water at Imperial Dam. So however you measure it, you have to actually have less water delivered to the valley. So you have a tension here between what may be perceived as an equitable baseline, meaning one that sort of discounts voluntary conservation measures that have recently been taking place, versus one that will promote greater water savings, which would include the existing water things. And another factor complicating the determination of the baseline is the difference in scope and quality of the metering pre and post QSA. Currently, the type of farm delivery metering is more than adequate for IID's purposes, billing mainly, but it does not, what you'll be comparing it to is flow meters installed with a contracting landowner, which will have a different level of accuracy, much higher level of accuracy. And on this one, like I said, our final report is going to include more detailed recommendations on calculations of the baselines, as Dr. Phil King would recommend. But this is, in broad scope, it needs to be workably simple for staff to be able to administer. But it is unfortunately a complicated question. But it is one that needs board attention immediately. The next one, again, is a minor finding relating to the aspects of the on-farm conservation program, and that is the proper term, length of term for a contract with a contracting landowner. And for administrative purposes, the issue must, the contract needs to be long enough to allow, essentially allow it to be administered, particularly as the ramping up schedule changes over time. But on the other hand, considering the participation levels that are required at full build-out, it is probably not a good idea necessarily to turn away shorter-term contracts. Dr. Phil King would recommend consideration of a 4-year contract as sort of either the not necessarily a requirement, but a goal, both in terms of reducing administrative burden on the IID, but also it would kind of smooth out differences in water use based on crop rotations. And it would also, to some extent, provide farmers greater assurance of continued incentive payments for the costlier on-farm improvements. But like it's yet at the same time, you're not necessarily wanting to turn people away considering how many you need to participate in the program. So again, our recommendation will be in greater detail in the final report, but where we're heading is recommending that the board consider either imposing a minimum, or what is probably more attractive, providing prioritized enrollment in the program, and possibly even greater incentives for contracts that contain a 4-year term. All right. The fifth finding has to do with sort of the mission of the IID and the recognition that the primary mission of IID water, obviously I'm talking about the water side, is to the delivery of water for mainly agricultural, but for all uses within the valley. To some extent, that mission is going to be altered by the QSA. The total amount of acre feet is roughly being conserved and transferred either to San Diego or Coachella or MWD, is roughly 10% of IID's quantified allocation. That results in a shifted mission. The QSA the IID will evolve to some extent from a water delivery entity to a water delivery and a water conservation entity. There is a question as what's the best way to staff such a shifted mission, and obviously that comes with the recognition that there are types of jobs, unique construction, custom type jobs, for which contracting out the work is a most cost effective. But a lot of the long-term projects tends to result in long-term benefits, financial benefits to the district for developing in-house capabilities of handling such projects. And this is a process that's already begun by the IID staff, but we're recommending continuation and reliance. And it's just kind of, I suppose, ironic for an outside consultant to say stop relying on outside consultants. But for the IID to continue to reevaluate its reliance on outside contractors, you have incredibly competent staff who are passionate about the projects and developing the in-house capacity to undertake the shift in mission imposed on the IID by the QSA will likely result in benefits to the IID. Similarly, in addition to staff competence, you have farmer competence, and there's a great deal of interest in the Water Conservation Advisory Board and using that interest and the interface between the IID board and the farm community to develop using that interface as the means of developing the on-farm conservation. Again, this is a process that's already begun, and so our recommendation is that it continue, that the Water Department continue to work closely through the Water Conservation Advisory Board, particularly as it relates to the on-farm conservation program. This is a big picture question. The definite plan, as it was required to do through its scoping, had to make quick decisions on projects to consider further and projects to discount out of hand due to budgetary issues. Dr. Phil King is recommending that the board at least consider and look at something closer to an all-in approach. And what I mean by that is, and what he means by that, is the definite plan targeted the 303,000 acre feet required and said, here's how the best way to meet that 303,000. Dr. Phil King's experience has been whenever you target a amount, you usually wind up with something close to 85 to 90% of that amount. An all-in approach would say, well, what's the way to maximize conservation regardless of our requirements under the QSA? And this will be described in greater detail through his contributions on the final report. But he has recommended his district in New Mexico, the Elephant Butte Irrigation District, has to some extent replaced some of their laterals with a piping system. And this was one of the things that was considered but rejected in the definite plan simply because the costs are too high. In Dr. King's impression was that perhaps that was too hasty of a rejection because there were other benefits to such a system apart from what was considered in the cost-benefit analysis in the definite plan. So this is another one that we'll have greater detail in our final report, but it is something that Dr. Phil King is recommending that the board at least consider and at least maybe target for further study. Okay, moving on to the financial, and again, this is to some extent the work of other people, and here is less recommendations than findings. Mike Sanderson, who is a numbers guy, consulted with us. He also, when accounting expertise was needed, brought in a CPA and to help us understand some of the numbers. We had multiple meetings with staff, and again, I can't emphasize enough how helpful staff has been throughout this whole process in providing us information that we requested and information we didn't request but we should have requested. But part of what the review entailed here is the 40-year model, financial model, 40-year financial plan, annual reports, both implementation reports of the QSA and Water Department reports, audited financials, and the like. In meetings with the CFO, with staff accountants, cost accountants, etc. And here, what Mike Sanderson's approach here was to separate out the normal IID Water Department operations from the QSA operations and to see how those two financial pictures interrelate. And also to take a look at some of the assumptions built into the 40-year model, including the one big assumption, which was that mitigation costs in excess of the cap would be covered by a different party. So from 2003 to 2010, the Water Department, separating out the things attributable to QSA, ran a slight surplus if you don't include a depreciation or replacement cost approach thing. They ran a deficit, and if you do account for such matters, but the QSA ran a significant surplus during that time, so it appears that to some extent, at least currently, QSA revenues are being used to prop up Water Department fundings. That was from 2003 to 2010. This is from this is the projected. This is from the 40-year plan. And it was separating out the IID Water Department, and if you want to count it as a separate accounting entity, the MWD program, which ought to be revenue neutral, and that it was a system whereby the costs were being funded by an outside party. So it had both revenues and costs, but they should result in zero. But for the 40-year period, even without a depreciation expense built in, we're looking at something on the order of a $347 million deficit for the IID Water Department. Contrasted with what the entity we're describing here as a total QSA, and I should clarify what that means, is broken out sometimes into separate entities. These are the entities provided for in the annual implementation reports. Particularly, the total QSA includes the water transfer, which is the bulk of the accounting entities, but it also includes the local entity, which was the compensation measure for the fallowing, the JPA, which was the manner for taking care of the environmental, and also the Western lands. Now, of these four entities, the middle two ought to be revenue neutral in that they have revenues coming in and out that balance out, but it's the water transfers in the Western lands that really have the significant revenues that aren't just simply pass-throughs. So projected for the 40 years is a surplus on the order of $2.6 billion through all four of these entities. However, and currently the 40-year model projects use of some of those revenues to cover essentially to cover the cash position of the IID Water Department. one of which is the replacement cost, the effective cash on the replacement cost, and these are cumulative, over the 40-year plan is $1.385 billion. Again, we've already seen the $347 million revenue shortfall. So that results in a total cash position, projected cash position for the IID over the 40-year horizon of $902 million. That is what is projected. This next slide is meant to show what could happen. We've already seen that the state has been less than forthcoming with funding the mitigation requirements and has not begun to undertake the restoration program that it promised. The mitigation revenue above the JPA cap, the JPA entity projected conservation costs. Backing out the contributions of the parties from those results shows that there is roughly a $1.15 billion revenue that was anticipated that would be covered by the state. This is the state's obligation under one estimation for mitigation. So backing that out on the assumption that, well, if the state isn't going to pay it, that's that much fewer in revenues for the whole QSA as a, remembering that it's the four entities put together, but the whole QSA as a whole. Comparing that, we get, so adjusting downward the revenues, we also have to take a look at the cost assumptions. The first one, the subsidies for the other IAD programs that was shown in the previous slide, this is the 40-year projected water department deficit plus the 1.3 billion and change replacement cost that is proposed to be coming from QSA revenues. If you, on the assumption that things always come in slightly over budget, we say, well, why don't we add a 5% cushion to the projected water conservation costs, a 10% cushion to the projected environmental costs, and assume that if the state never lives up to its promise to restore the Salton Sea to a sustainable level, that the IID can't simply let that go, or the valley can't simply let that go, that they're going to have to do something in order to make it livable in this area. We said, well, let's take the preferred alternative, which at the time, I think it's been downwardly adjusted, but at the time was roughly $9 billion. Assume that we're going to have to do something on the order of 5% of that, and come up with $450 million. The result of which is, if the state does not do what it promised to do, which unfortunately the court held is a constitutional promise because it's an unenforceable promise, then the $902 million surplus projected could easily turn into a $1.3 billion deficit. And that ends mine. And now Chuck, I believe, is going to discuss the final recommendations.
Thank you.
Let me just comment on the last slide. The idea was that the way the QSA came together, it was both conservation and environmental mitigation, they were both presumed outcomes over time with the most optimistic of projections. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's often the way you do these things if these are ballpark numbers. But as things change, we know now, for example, that the 1.125 billion coming from the state isn't going to come there. We also know that water conservation at the margin is very hard to do, and it can be more expensive and there are overruns. We know that, for example, the mitigation costs almost always exceed what people thought. We know that the whole issue of the decline in the environment as a result of the absence of restoration at the Salton Sea is going to add material. So our purpose in the slide was to not tell you we know this is going to happen. It's to display things that could happen so that you start thinking today about how you deal with those if they do, and make some plans and get your partners together to start addressing it rather than waiting until the next lawsuit because somebody didn't do something. That's the purpose of that slide. Our recommendations, I'll just quickly go through them. The first one, we believe that it's important to overturn decision number 1600. And let me explain why that is so important. In our view, there will be a water conservation program out of the QSA. That water conservation program will be one developed by the farming community and the IID with in-house expertise. It won't be a theoretical plan, it will be a real thing. And it will probably not produce the amount of conserved water or at the cost you anticipated. But what's the consequence of that? Is it a breach and is it a waste of water? No, it's not a waste of water or a breach if you've made the reasonable efforts within your economic capacity to do the job, and if the net result is simply the tailwater goes into the Salton Sea, because it's not a waste of water to have the water go into the Salton Sea if you've done everything you can to make it work. So basically, it is our view that you need to evaluate it, continue to bring things in-house, work on it the way you have been, but alert everyone that it is the view of the IID that if you do your best, if you exercise reasonable conservation and beneficial use, you are not in breach of anything. Consistent with that, it's okay that the definite plan report was simply a theoretical document. It was an attempt to try to define how one could go about it. Your staff is already realizing that they'll need trial and error, but again, that's the focus of our recommendation, is that once you've done your best and once you've actually engaged and collaborated with the farming community, then you're not in breach. The other thing that our recommendation was that given the way the EPA is coming down hard on the BMT-10 and the various emission standards and the possible sanctions, it's important to try to, it's okay to legally defend a lawsuit and do your best, and lawyers do that well, but you got to get, at the same time, you need to open up those avenues of communication. Our point here is, yes, the cash now that you have for replacement of things, you've got a $50 million advance that you'll pay back later, a loan from the revisions of the amendment number 5. But it is a question, it is not too long before you're going to be facing the fact that things cost more than they do, and you're going to be up to the cap on your obligation to spend. That is to say, the obligations of others to spend in 4 or 5 years. Then what's going to happen? You should start now to try to evaluate when that occurs, when are you going to run out of funds, and who's going to pay for it. Our view is that you should indicate to the JPA partners that the anticipated cost for mitigation should be allocated among the beneficiaries, and everybody should work to keep those costs down, but if they exceed it, you can't just stop. We also list a series of things that the board that come out of the financial section that the board should evaluate. And they're just questions, they're not recommendations, but they're questions you need to understand. We've illustrated how QSA funds are being utilized to support water operations. That's not a good or a bad thing, that's a fact. And there's a synergy between the two. You can't have a good operation if the rest of it isn't working. But the first question is, are the proper amount of QSA funds being allocated to support other IID functions? Is that the right proportion? Should it be increased or decreased? Based upon the discussions and collaborative efforts, what are we doing right now? How much are we reserving for QSA future expenses? How much is properly being spent today? The board should discuss and go up front on what it's going to do with the air quality issues in dealing with the county. You need to obviously look at the other techniques for environmental mitigation. You ought to think about at least what happens with respect to restoration of the Salton Sea, and I know you have, but these are real tangible concrete problems that are coming before the board. And I'm going to, rather than go through those, the last two, I think I can summarize them. And let me make this point very quickly. We really have 3 points. Our first one is that the water conservation program is not going to work like it's planned. It'll be up to the farmers to do it. And if it doesn't work exactly as planned, that will not be a breach. It will be reasonable and beneficial use of water because you've done your best efforts, and you need to start down that road and understand it, and there's nothing wrong with that. The second one is, if you don't conserve the maximum amount as anticipated under the QSA, you're not wasting water. You have done what is reasonable and beneficial use. You're not in breach, you're not wasting water if you've done your best and if you've taken control of the problem. And the third one is that because you clearly could face a deficit over the 40-year time period, acknowledge that, embrace it, evaluate it. If you think we're wrong, conclude we're wrong, but at least address the question, how are you going to address it if the deficit does come up? And so the behavior then is not going out today and filing a lawsuit against somebody. It's just doing what you can do. You start conserving. If it doesn't work, let them tell you you're not doing it right. You accelerate mitigation, do your best. If someone says that's not okay, let them tell you you're not doing back, but be proactive and control the problem, not file a lawsuit in anticipation of it. If you can do those two things and you understand the numbers, then I think there are things to do to make all of this work. Thank you.
Okay, Chuck, you may want to stay there.
Okay.
Because board may have questions and
I just
staff.
want to ask
and then-
him a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Mars, so are you in support of the IID's petition to the State Water Resources Board?
Yes, that's what we are in support of it because we feel it accelerates mitigation. That was its intent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other board questions? Director Hanks, do you want to start off?
No, I'd
Okay.
like to follow up last this time.
Director Sanchez? Okay, well, that's fine. We'll let the public go, and then we're going to come back to the board, and then Mr. Silva may have some comments also. So, Chuck, you may want to stand there to that other mic there by Mr. Garber, and
I see, okay.
if anybody from the public has questions,
You want to answer?
Oscar, I think Mr. Benson's coming up
It's
first.
all yours, Chuck. You're good.
Steve, are you coming to ask questions? Okay. If anybody has any questions, would you get in line like Steve Scroney's doing over there? So, unless you're going out the door, Steve.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you, board, for bringing this to the public. I think it's eye-opening for a lot of us here. We've been talking about it for a while. Also, thank you, Chuck and team. You did a great job. In my view, the IID board has the right and the fiduciary responsibility to protect the ratepayers. I think both water and power are key to this valley and to our future. I look at it for the last 8.5 years that this board sat by and watched the QSA as we spent money propping up the water department, working on studies, conservation plans. I feel that as a member of the Farm Bureau and chairman of the Water Conservation Board, I really watch the IID board and I work with staff, but they've all supported the definite plan as the way out. I think what Mr. Dumars said today is, what if farmers don't sign up? We all know that that's a real possibility in the world, especially with good farm prices. We look at what's happening in the Central Valley, and they got cut to 30% this year. The only fallback I see is that we might be forced into a fallowing situation, which I don't think anybody wants. I'll ask a question at the end about that, but my view is that IID win in the court is really a loss for the valley. You were going against Imperial County over air quality. I have 4 children. Everyone here has children or is a child of somebody. I don't think anyone wants to see the next generation have to move away because of decisions we made in the last 8.5 years. I really think it's a problem with asthma, fewer jobs, less tax revenue to the city. It's the same issues that were talked about in the Renewable Energy Conference, the difference between solar versus geothermal. Where does the tax base go and what happens to the farmland? It was never brought up what happens to the water with those solar, so I'd like to know if you have any viewpoint on that, where that'll be moved in the court of law. I just want to say, if I get elected to the IID board, I want to stop the flow of water until we rethink the QSA and understand all the implications. I think we're far enough along that our future is going out the door with every drop of water. I have not seen this board present any policies that really change the direction they've been going. All they've been doing is supporting their lawsuits for the last 8.5 years. And I would like to know what the board's policy is based on the outcome of your talk here. The question I have is, I've heard that force fallowing, which is the only way out of conservation, is that a form of conservation? Is that allowed under the QSA? I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
No, in my view, the QSA defines fallowing, places a limit on it. It contemplates conservation. It doesn't allow you to force people to fallow. But that will be where push comes to shove, where you do your best, you operate these programs and you get behind, then the board will come to a choice. I would be very surprised if the board argued for fallowing. That's not been the policy. But ultimately, that is the contest, isn't it? Because a statement was made that I think is significant. It goes just quickly through the findings, that in some ways looking at your program, you go from a water distribution company supporting ag, which, by the way, from best I can see, looking at your infrastructure, and Dr. King is very impressed by the efficiencies with which you do things here. But now you're embarking on the function of becoming a water conservation entity. That's not the function of an IID. The water is not to become really good at producing water. It's to make water available for agriculture so that farmers can be more efficient. And as a byproduct, they make more water available. They don't conserve to make water available and try to take it away from farmers. Those are two very different mindsets. But that's the point. Our point is that your job is to do the job you do, and when you do it well, there will be some conserved water, but it's not the reverse. It's not figuring out how to conserve by fallowing or otherwise, and then incidentally letting people farm. Those are two very different mindsets about the same problem.
Okay, Chuck. Steve Scaroni.
Well, here, age before beauty. Go ahead.
That's Steve. Wait, Oscar, sit down. Steve's up next.
Sit down.
No?
He just gave me the
Well,
floor.
he's okay.
Anyway, my name's.
President, though. He's the president.
Well, I even asked before Mr. Benson.
Oscar, get it over with, please.
Okay,
Go ahead and
thank you.
speak.
Oscar Gonzalez. First of all, I want to thank the gentleman for his presentation and his staff, but I think you guys didn't address and didn't mitigate what Mr. Mike Morgan elucidated during the water transfer, and that was namely the adverse impact that it caused on Native Americans, Cocopa, Quechan, Mexican Americans, etc. It did not address also the adverse impact it's causing on Mexicali, Baja California, Mexico. However, Mr. John Carter put a position paper, and I read it, and the whole document talks about water conservation and the impact, the adverse impact it has on Mexicali. I think we have to understand and not be naive that because there's a border, hey, we're all family. This is the Colorado Basin. We're all united. We've got relatives, and I know some farmers have kids over there. They're not immigrated. That's true. That's right on. And I've gone with a couple of them.
Are they them in the room here?
No, I can take you to Playboy Club too. Mexicali. But anyway, more importantly, I agree with what Mr. Benson said, and I remember talking and drinking beer with his father at Louis Legaspi's gas station in 1975 up. I remember Mr. Moore. I've met a lot of the directors. But I'm painfully to say that even this board does not focus on the adverse impact it has on Mexicali, the water conservation. There may be a border, there may be a fence, but we're all related. If you were to read La Voz de la Frontera and see Antonio Magaña every night on 66, he viciously attacks the gringos. He uses, I say Caucasian, but pay attention on Channel 66, Mexicali, that's all they talk about. And the experts, the water engineer experts from Mexico, not from Mexicali, even from the president, say that the IID has ignored them, and I believe it. Even Lázaro can't think of the president in 1958 when the salt.
Oscar, let's stick with Mr. DeMar's presentation.
Well, I'm giving you history because
Okay,
you don't know.
we don't need the history. Let's
Let
stick
me
with this
just say this.
presentation.
You know, what they didn't address was that the impact it was going to have, and you should do that, Mr. Menville. You're running for re-election, that they didn't discuss the adverse impact not only on the wildlife and also not only the adverse impact it's having on poor people, and more importantly, the wildlife. And they still didn't address it. They haven't mitigated it. Thanks to Mike Morgan, I got educated on that. I worked for Mike Morgan for a while.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Scrone.
Did you listen?
Yes, sir. I've heard what you said. Thank you.
I hope you internalize it.
Thank you.
Mr.
Okay,
Gonzalez, I'd like to say thank you for being Steve Benson's campaign manager. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not his campaign manager.
Okay. Steve, go ahead.
Did I stand in line okay?
Yeah, you did a great job, Steve.
Hey, call us gringos, not Caucasians, okay?
You want to be called gringo?
Absolutely.
I don't want to be called Taco Bell.
Well, I wasn't going to. Okay. Hey, I remember drinking beer down at Legaspi's too. That's when politics used to be really good.
Your dad, is he still alive?
No, sir.
Gonzalez, would you sit down, please? Thank you. No, you're done. Thank you. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Menville, you thought I was a problem. Did I stand in line okay?
Yeah, but see, he's a bulldog. You went to El Centro, right? So
I went to Heber.
Oh, you went to
Okay.
Heber. Anyway, go ahead.
I was just telling Chuck, and I just want to tell everybody, Chuck, I mean, I really appreciate, I mean, you are walking such a fine professional line here, and you've pretty much laid it out. And, you know, like you said, people got to make a decision. I mean, you're not twisting anybody's arm, and appreciate how you've done this. And in this kind of politically charged environment we're in right now, I don't know if anybody else would have the skill that you, in the way you've presented this. I want to just ask a couple comments. You mentioned about slide 21, and this is just some comments, and I do have some questions I want to ask for follow-up. And this is just a personal opinion, and slide 21, and, you know, it talks about the litigation and how a lot of times things are solved business to business versus getting a bunch of attorneys involved. And I completely agree with you. Okay. But it would be my position, and I think the position of many people in this audience, that the confusion in the litigation is a planned event by our dream team. They intentionally create all this litigation and confusion so that there can't be that business to the business dialogue. That would be my opinion on that position, and I think our three directors up here support that confusion and just that constant litigation.
Mr.
Where we
Scaroni, please
can't.
do not talk for myself, please. I have my own opinion, so don't involve me in what you're saying. You don't speak for me.
Wouldn't want to, Mrs. Mendoza.
You don't.
Continue, Steve.
So anyway, and I want to get to the subject of breach.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if, and I am from Heber, so I'm a little bit slow, but are you saying that if we don't conserve the water and make it available for transfer, but yet we tried our best, we did reasonable efforts, that under the terms of the QSA as they are tonight, that would not constitute breach?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, if under the way I read the QSA and its intent, everyone from the Bureau, when they came in writing in on the 417 horse to try to squeeze water out of the IID, to the California Water Resources Board, it was always contemplated that the water transferred would be as a result of bona fide conservation efforts, not fallowing and not.
Yeah, so in 2016, when's the fallowing go away?
2014 if the petition, 2017 if it goes away, and it'll go away then no matter what. But my point is that if you do that, even though the technical language of the, and Steve read it to you, might suggest it's a default if you don't complete the conservation, my argument has 2 points. First, you've done your best, which are reasonable efforts at beneficial use. So they can't cause, it is not designed to force people to have the state police come over and force people to conserve water. It's voluntary, people participate, and people will participate if it's properly designed. Once they do that, it is not a waste of water if the balance of the water goes into the sea. The decision 1600 said it was, but it isn't. Right. And so I say it's not a breach if you've made your reasonable and efforts to put it to reasonable beneficial use, then that's all you can do. If they say no, let them come and try to take it away. But you've got to take a stand on what your role is in conservation.
So a rational, reasonable man's strategy would be to, as you suggest, to get 1600 overturned, and then we make our best effort to conserve. We don't hit the target, which I think it's pretty obvious we're not going to hit the targets. But we're not going to create a breach situation under that scenario. But do we have I'm trying to get back. My question is, what is the liability here if we don't perform? Because I see we're not going to be able to perform. I mean, I think that's obvious. And I realize that, you're trying to let us make our own decisions here, but we're not going to be able to perform under this current, agreement. So, when does it become best efforts, or you guys just, what I'm concerned about is a liability against the water right. Wherein that, if you guys would spend another $200 an acre foot, you could conserve the water, but yet the terms of the deal do not provide the revenue to cover that, and it comes out of the farmer's pocket or IID's pocket, which then comes out of the farmer's pocket. Have you rationalized or thought through that scenario of what point they can say reasonable stops and starts?
No, I think it'll be a case by case situation, but honestly, if you employ the people in this area, if they go out and they visit the farmers themselves, they work through the advisory council, they all decide that, then they come up and Jesse works with them, they've done their very best with a simple enforceable program, and if they only get 85%, if they need 85 and they get 70, but they've done it, then it would be up to the burden of proof shifts to the other entity to say this is a breach. This is a breach by you because you haven't done enough. And then, you'll have to deal with the Bureau of Reclamation and the California Water Resources Board. That's a much better case than simply in the abstract arguing, wait a minute, we're going to reach X. Do it, do your best, and take control of it, assert your policy and finish it.
Well, but we still have a legal liability with San Diego that they could make an argument that we breached by not providing the conserved water.
Well, they can make any argument they want.
Well, I realize, it's just a matter of filing a lawsuit, which we're getting real good at. Okay.
No.
I think maybe more of that will come out.
Yeah.
Now, on slide 52, I just want to understand these financials. There again, I'm from Heber, so I'm a little bit slow. Is that, on slide 52, that 92 million right here? Is that, it says QSA revenues applied to support IID water. Is that what was used to subsidize the water department operation, or does that include some conservation and fallowing payments?
Steve can mention it, but it is an integrated number, but we came up with it. Why don't you explain it, Steve? That's the 92.
The 92 million. I guess my real question is, and I think everybody in this, a lot of the farmers would like to know, what is our real cost of running this water department here if the QSA didn't exist and if we had decision 1600 overturned? What is our real cost? How inefficient is our water department on today's water rates? Okay. For the cost of water. I guess that's really my real question.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I can answer that question.
But I mean, 92... whatever money is going from the transfer to subsidize pure water delivery operations is the number of inefficiency or the net loss from revenues to cost.
Well, what that number represents is the fact that a depreciation expense is not included in the IID Water Department rate calculations. So you'll see it's equivalent to the
Right.
$92 million deficit. The assumption being that, you operate on a cash basis, so you have cash coming in, cash coming out. Depending on how you allocate it, is how it shows up as being a loss or a gain. And if the IID Water Department had adequate revenues to cover its depreciation expense, it would require $92 million more. Since it doesn't cover that expense, the assumption is, to the extent that it's a cash effect, which a depreciation expense isn't automatically a cash effect, but to the extent that it is being covered by the QSA.
Well, and depreciation though, but I mean, I know it's a book number, but it's also a real number because, again, I'm just a dumb guy from Heber, but I have a large equipment component at my business, and if I don't accrue depreciation to replace equipment, that's an asinine business model. So what we're saying here is we're not accruing, or we're not spending for replacement of assets as they deteriorate and wear out. Is that another way of saying this?
I think that was the conclusion, yes.
Okay, well, like I said, I'm sorry about my simplicity on accounting. So we're running an asinine business model here. Okay, I know you can't say that, but I can because I'm from Heber. Well, I guess one other question I have is that you mentioned Amendment 5, which I think is a pet peeve with a lot of us.
I did.
Yeah, I think, Chuck, you mentioned what we got the $50 million advance or whatever we got. And what did we give up for that? We still haven't got a straight answer of what we gave up. I know San Diego just didn't give us $50 million because, they like to go to Glamis. I mean, what did we give up for Amendment 5? I don't even think our directors know because, they've never said anything. And
Don't speak for me, I know.
Brady, huh?
Don't speak for me, I know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I speaking for you again, Jim? I'm sorry. Okay, you know what? You're right. Mr. Hanks would know. What did we give up?
Well, that was a negotiated number. You look at Amendment 5, the numbers are it's complicated, but fairly straightforward. You got the opportunity.
Oh, so it's another complicated legal agreement?
No, they're all complicated. This is not a simple deal, but the simple fact is it was a trade-off. It's a $50 million advance, which you will then, by agreeing to get out of market numbers for market transaction numbers in the future for the price of water and fixing at a particular rate, then at that point, over time, somebody will get more or less depending on what happens in the price of water. But it's an advance. It is not a payment. It is a liability. You have it available. You can spend it, but ultimately, the other end at the bottom end, you'll have to pay it back because the amount of remuneration for water changes. But it's pretty straightforward.
Well, and I understand that, and a lot of us farmers do that in our business. We take an advance against a crop, but we do have to pay it back. But it sounds like what you're saying is we gave up our market-based escalators to get that advance. Is that a simple way to say it?
That's a simple way. It's not. It's a little more complicated than that. But you asked me essentially how it works. I think I've described it. We didn't go. There are a number of things we didn't go into. We didn't go and evaluate. We could, and we've looked at that number, but frankly, we were up a little, our elevation was a little higher than that. And so we're glad we could look at that question again and explain it in the final report if it were useful.
Well, I think a lot of us would like to know about this Amendment 5 because here again, I think there's a couple things we know. Death, taxes, fuel's going to go up, and water's going to go up. Mm-hmm. So to give up market-based escalators, to me, there again, it's asinine business. I mean, that's what I think, but I mean, I know you can't comment on that. But the other thing that on that Amendment 5 that I just would like to have in the record, so hopefully JP, Gloria won't tell you not to put this in, but what I'd like to have in the record is that Amendment 5 was done, sealed, and delivered by Brady before the board ever approved it. So just like to have that in the record, that Amendment 5 was done by your former general manager and the board never ratified it until after the deal was done. And here again, it sounds like another asinine business deal that the idea is becoming famous for. Okay, the other question I have, and I know this isn't a question for you, it's more a question for the board. There's an elephant in the room that's missing. Where is the dream team? Well, Osias? I mean, where's the dream team? Why?
We're here to listen to Mr. DeMars and make his presentation.
Well, but I think, you guys have based our future, and it looks like you've made some asinine business decisions here based on advice from the dream team. And I'd like to hear some kind of discourse between.
The reason we brought Mr. DeMars in is to give us a second opinion and come up with a plan B. If there's flaws in the QSA, which there may very well be, so we can get it straightened out. That's what he's here for.
Well, okay, and that's fine, but to continue with the legal advice of a group of people who have given you what is, to this dumb Heber guy, a very, very flawed contract, and for you all to continue to support that dream team and continue to pay them millions of dollars a year, again, to me, is just completely asinine. Jim, did you have a response to that?
Yeah,
you were raising your hand.
You mentioned a while ago about the compromise agreement, which was the Fifth Amendment.
Yeah, Amendment 5.
In the Fifth Amendment, it was a pre-arbitration settlement of a dispute over the pricing. And the pricing was the formula that was agreed to in the QSA. There was a dispute between San Diego and IID of the terms. In the agreement, that became a fixed number with a built-in escalator. I believe the escalators, the inflation factor is 2.4%. And what we gave up on the, besides that adjustment there, which is kind of an unknown factor because we don't know exactly what the formula would have produced, was also the shortage premiums up to the year 2034.
We gave that up also?
We gave that up in the event that there was a shortage on the river. There was a factor built in of about 3 times the going rate.
And we gave that up?
Gave it up to 2034.
Okay. Now, and here again, the reason that we had to get that $50 million and we went and gave this stuff up is because we were not managing the finances correct. And because usually when I have to go get an advance for what I do, it's because I'm lost money someplace or made a mistake. So is that 50, that forced us, we didn't manage the finances right. We hired a bunch of people at high salaries and did all this stuff that we've done the last 5 or 6 years. So we're short. So Brady had to run to San Diego, get a $50 million advance, and gave up these different things you just noted.
I think there was a $6 million settlement in there immediately. The $50 million, I believe $25 million is on the books for expenditures this year for a SCADA system and some of the other infrastructure and what we call the clawback. But when you ask what did we give up, to me, the big concern that I have and what I'm hearing in the presentation is the fact that we have a business case or a business model built on revenue flow from the state for mitigation purposes. But yet, in our defense of our arguments, it was argued that nobody could force the state to appropriate money. But we went ahead and use that money built into our case. Now, to me, that wasn't wise. That is the crutch of the red numbers that you see, is the fact now we have a big black hole there, and we're going to have to figure out how we compensate that. If the state's not going to step up, then we either have to raise the water rates or we have to find a different model of how we're going to conserve water, because the balance sheet doesn't balance out with the financials.
Well, Mr. Hanks, first of all, I do want
let me start. When you say raise the water rates, you mean raise the water rates to the farm community?
No, I'm talking about raising the price of the water we're selling.
Oh, yeah, okay. To make up the difference, to fill the hole. Yeah, okay.
JP, basically, Rodney missed a zero, I think, or maybe 2 or 3 zeros.
Okay.
The little genius Rodney Smith.
I think Director Sanchez has a question he wants to ask.
Mr. Dumars, this is the reason why at the beginning of the opening statements, I kind of said what I said was, we see here people taking it as facts without details. And as Mr. Scaroni said, he likes to make business dialogue And I know he doesn't go into any business decisions without looking at the details before making a business decision, which is why I was hoping that you would give the details before the presentation. That way, if I can agree with you, I can see why I agree with you. If I don't agree with you, I can tell you why I don't agree with you. But right now, based on assumptions, I can't do either, and so my hands are tied, but people in the audience are taking this as fact. My second thing is, I agree with you, Steve, that we need to get the Dream Team in here, and I was hoping that they would be in here, but I think they wanted the time for Mr. Dumars to give his presentation, because as you know, we need to have healthy dialogue, and the dialogue that should come out of that meeting would be who best represents the truth and how we can move forward with the district.
Well, you know, Anthony, it's funny because I made some notes here on your opening comment. I'd like to respond to what you just said. You said a couple of things when you opened earlier. First of all, you said we need to understand the politics. Well, or somebody said that. Who said that? I thought you said that we have to understand.
I think Mr. Mars talked about politics.
Steve.
No, you
Steve,
said
you have some
California
other
politics.
questions you
We
want
gotta
to ask
understand
Mr. Mars?
Yeah, JP, I got some questions,
well,
got them
ask
all
your
written down
questions
here,
to
but
Mr. DeMars,
I'm
please.
responding to what Mr. Sanchez said
That's fine. We're
about
here to
the
listen to
data.
Mr. DeMars, so would you please ask him the questions that you came to the podium for?
I'm getting there, JP.
Okay,
And I
thank you.
lined up good for you. Now, just let me go here, okay?
yeah,
I'm almost done here, okay? Just relax, okay?
That's right. Understanding California's politics, not necessarily. I thought you were saying IID's politics.
Well, no. You said mention about
California's
yeah,
politics.
and Anthony, I think the best thing the IID could do is follow the law first and worry about politics. But you know, you last time Mr. DeMars was here, you kind of keep hammering on about these facts. And Anthony, I just hope you're applying the same criteria to the Dream Team. I mean, you said, you know, he's getting paid $250,000 to do this, and you said you were demanding guarantees at the last presentation.
No, I wasn't
I mean,
demanding
we've given the
guarantees.
Dream Team millions and millions of dollars, and we've got a mess on our hands.
Well, I
so
think
I hope you're applying the same criteria of accountability to your Dream Team that you're busting Mr. DeMars' chops on.
Well, I think my past statement, I think pretty much answered it when I said we need to have both here and let the comments be made, and let's see which
Anthony,
truth
I
cuts the
hope
butter.
you as a director, you're my director. You're a Hebrew homeboy. Viva la raza, okay? But I need you to make sure that, you know, you're applying that same criteria to the Dream Team as far as guarantees and all this stuff that you demanded in facts, because everything I've seen from your Dream Team is a big cloud of ambiguity. And I do want to thank Mr. Hanks, because I know he is a director that reads everything and analyzes everything. And Mr. Hanks, I do want to recognize your efforts on that.
Thank you.
When there's a document or something that needs to be approved, I know you've read it, and I thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thanks, JP.
Larry Gilbert, you're up next.
He didn't line up correctly. He was against the. He should have been right there. Okay, now you can go.
Thank you, President Menville. My thanks to the board for commissioning this study and the reports, and also compliments to Mr. DeMars and his team for preparing it and presenting it. I noticed a number of references where they said they would looked at it from a practical point of view, and in listening to the report, I think they did just exactly that, and my compliments to them for doing that. Comments about that it's going to be extremely daunting if we are able to accomplish the amount of conservation that we're pledged to do by efficiency, and that is certainly the intention. That will be a daunting task, and to kind of borrow a phrase, I think that if we accomplish it, we will have boldly gone where nobody has ever gone before. But I think it may be possible. And I think that we need to work at that very, very strongly. The comments about coordinating the system with the on-farm conservation, I think, is extremely important. They're not two separate issues. We cannot do what's possible on the farm if the system won't accommodate our needs to do that. And I think that's very important. I think it's also comforting that we can think that if we get as far as we can, and that's as much as we can do, and it doesn't fulfill it, that it's very comforting to think that maybe we would not be in breach at that point. However, I think that's something that we can work on, but kind of leave it in the background of our mind, because now Our job is to do the very best that we can to avoid getting in that situation. And I don't think we would be able to declare that we were not in breach if we didn't fulfill our full obligation and we had money left over. I was a little puzzled by the first scenario that showed quite a bit of money left over with the original premise that we might not be able to make it and we better be prepared so that we wouldn't be in breach if we couldn't get all the way. I hope that we can do this by efficiency, and I think the program that he has laid out is one that the district is working towards. And if we cooperate and work together and do the best we can, I hope that we can accomplish it. Because if we can, it's a win-win situation for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. Appreciate your long support of trying to take care of water conservation in Imperial Valley. Go ahead, Rusty.
Hello, Mr. President Benville. Rusty Jordan Brawley again. The only thing I think about Decision 1600 is you shouldn't try to go back and litigate the error of 1980 because it might not have been an error, but have the onus of that ongoing decision removed because we're now efficient. Not what we were when the sea was going up, the sea is going down. There's some real physical facts that I think I've talked to you about before. If you have a salty piece of ground and you put water on it, it'll run across it and you can water it in no time at all. As the ground gets better, it takes more water and it continues to take more water. Thus, the amount of water applied to the ground can increase with time as you improve the water. We have continually, for 80 years, put tile in Imperial Valley. The effect of that tile is improving and improving the ground. It's improving the amount of water the land will take and grow a crop. The efficiency of the use of the water is thus increasing. We do not have excess water wasting charge that we had in the past. It may be that if you go to the State Water Resources Control Board, they'll come up with some things you need to do to prove that you're being efficient. And there couldn't be anything really wrong with that. They had what doubled or triple charge for putting more than 15% of your order in the tail box. Having a machine or a monitor to do that, if that is the cost of being efficient, would be well worth it. I don't know if that's where they would go, but I think that we are more efficient today than we were in 1980, and that we can be more efficient without major changes in the system, and that we may be able to get off the onus of the 1600 decision because of that. And I really enjoyed the presentation, and you can tell that there's some integrity with the people that presented it. And I hope you take it to heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rusty. Chuck?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I think he is correct. You are efficient. You're getting more efficient. To the degree there's any onus left from that case, because it is somehow taken as precedent that putting water in the Salton Sea is waste. I think that part we should get rid of. But I agree with him that the idea is we are now efficient. If there's an onus at any kind from that case, we need to get rid of it.
Okay, thank you. Mark McBroom, you're up next.
Mark McBroom, President, Pearl County Farm Bureau. I'd like to make a statement with a follow-up question. First of all, I'd like to thank you and Mr. Dumars and his staff for presenting a very thoughtful, concise, and what we would believe is almost a great evaluation audit from a third party who has no skin in the game. There's no benefit from them. They don't live in California. They don't have a benefit of water transfer to where they live. They are here merely as to audit what we've done over the last 8.5 years, or however long it may have been. To me, it looks like it is a very well put, concise evaluation of where we need to go. And I would just hope and pray that the board would consider, my question would be, to effectively look at what they've been presented and to really evaluate and go forward with Mr. DeMar's recommendations, his evaluations, and his findings, and perhaps take a different tact. It is such an adversarial state to see where the one of the points that I think was very complete was where we have the IID and the county suing each other. And we're basically suing each other with the same money. And all we do is continue to raise our costs of living here up and raise our costs of water users and power users up by having to fight each other over the same thing. And it should be to our own benefit that we look after all the residents and the ratepayers as we go forward and really evaluate that. So I would just thank you and ask you again to please give this some serious consideration.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Those are all good points. Mr. Kuhn, you're up next.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Bruce.
Not always fun sitting in those chairs, is it? Look, I think the presentation was excellent. I'll speak clearly and loudly. Anyway, I think the presentation was excellent, and it was very well put. I would encourage you to allow Mr. DeMars to bring the finished product. And certainly, it really did seem as though it was politically neutral. That's not something that happens around here very often. So it was encouraging, and I found it refreshing. Some things that were brought up concern me. And, you know, back in the day when we put this thing together, you know, it wasn't a perfect document, and it wasn't professed to be a perfect document. You know, I got a call from Don Cox the day after we voted on it, and to quote Don, he said, "It took a lot of guts for you to do that." I've got that on tape. He was speaking to my message machine. Anyway, and he said, "I don't know, can't imagine what would have happened if we didn't have the agreement." And that said, the agreement, whether we liked it or not, wasn't perfect. But what I'm hearing here today is the agreement we had that wasn't perfect seems to be getting, or seems to have been altered to where if you didn't like the one you had, the one we're getting now, or at least the changes that have been made to it, haven't been for the better. They've been kind of for the worse. And I look forward to finding out exactly what happened to the, you know, Don was big on a locked box for the money. And I don't see it. And it looks like it's been used. And the board voted to put the money from the revenues of the transfer in what was termed a locked box, an account where it would be there accruing interest and not used to support the IID, but to support those conservation efforts when the time came when we came off fallowing. And I truly do fear that money's been used, and I believe some of the evidence in this finding here supports that. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's money there, but it doesn't look like it. And therefore, again, if you didn't like it before, it seems like it may not be for the better now. But I look forward to finding out. Thank you for your time.
Bruce, we had Mr. Broking run the numbers on the transfer, and he showed that 30% of the transfer money was supporting the water department, and that's public information. And that came out whenever it was that we had Mr. Broking run those numbers. I requested that to be run, and that's what they came up with.
But I've not heard where the rest of the money is then.
That's fact. Well, they've got it. It's Mr. Broking. I don't believe he's here. Is Ed Hall, you're here. You want to comment on that?
Oh, that's Mr. Broken.
I didn't see him back there.
He's hiding.
708 million in there.
Well, there has been money from the transfer that has been used to support the water department operations. And what hasn't been used for the transfer or to support water department operations is in the bank.
How much?
Well, I don't know that exact amount, but there's I think there's around $100 million of unrestricted money in the water department.
Mr. Brokine?
Yes.
That's my understanding. There's about 107 million in the reserves there. But it was also part of the QSA that a percentage of the water transfer revenue could be used in the water department. But it's very difficult to separate it out over the years, and part of our efforts here with the budget resolution that we passed was to separate out the revenues and expenditures. So whenever you're looking at what was the actual cost to the water department, it's very tough because the revenues and the expenses were all part of one unit. And it's hard to separate what part of a person's salary was used on the transfer, some of those issues you can separate.
Yeah, we have that
But the
done
way we're setting
internally,
up the
yes.
books now should take care of that.
Yes.
Yeah, when the board passed the budget, 5-0, this last budget, we pretty much cleaned everything up, and we know where the water's going at, separate accounts and everything, where the transfer money is and where all the money is. So that was with the aid of Mr. Hanks, and I worked on the budget committee. We got all that cleaned up.
Yes, that was part of the 2012 budget resolution.
Yes, that's correct. Okay, Mr. Kuhn.
Well, let me reiterate. I hope it's there. I really do, but it doesn't sound like it. And I don't know how much was used, but again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there was supposed to be a locked box that that this money was supposed to go in, so we would be poised and ready to spend it on farm conservation when the time came. And again, doesn't sound like that it's there. I hope it is. And if it is, it would be very simple to find out how much is there and how much of the revenue from the water transfer has been used and how much has been banked. I mean, it's not really something that we need a CPA to do. But
I'm sure Mr. Broking would be glad to meet with you, and you could sit
I'd be
down
more
with
than
him
happy
and
to
he
sit
can
down
explain
any
the
time,
numbers
but
to you,
I'd
Bruce.
really like it to be made public, not just for my information.
I think it's
anyway.
all public information, Bruce. It's all public information.
I can appreciate that. I just mean it would be nice if it were shared in a public.
It's been shared in the public at many meetings, Bruce.
That how much has been brought in and how much has been spent?
Yes. Mr. Broking, would you answer his
But I asked
question
that
for
question.
him again? Mr. Kuhn.
We can do this. I don't want to take people's time.
That's okay. Mr. Broking, come and answer his question about he's doubtful that you're keeping track of the money from the water transfer.
Well, yes, I've made 3 or 4 presentations on the water transfer about the revenues and expenses, and I can provide those to Mr. Kuhn. And if that doesn't answer his specific questions, I'll be happy to meet with him and go over it, and then we can make that public.
All right. Thank you.
Well, I thank you. Again, it's evident with the findings of this report that there's been substantial amounts used. That said, I'm not going to beat a dead horse. Secondly, if the cost escalators were negotiated away, one only needs to read the paper as to what Met's doing right now all over. I mean, they're raising the rates substantially to all of their member agencies, especially pounding on San Diego. And if those cost escalators were in there, I venture to guess that the $50 million may well pale in comparison to what you could have got if we hadn't negotiated. I hope we didn't. I really hope we didn't, but if we did, we did. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Morgan.
Mike Morgan, Brawley, California.
And I appreciate it, John. While I was in line in Steve Scaroni's spot, I came up with 3 more questions as a gift from you.
Okay, that's good.
You're
welcome.
To start with, if I recall, last fall or so, you guys were getting an update on what would happen if the appeals court judge did not overturn Candy's decision. And it was at that time you were told there was $8 million in excess money in the water department coming from the transfer. I never saw it before that. The 7 or 8 years you've been here before that, I never saw it on any of your water department budgets. I never saw it in the cost of service study you did before you raised the water rates and then had a 218 election. It wasn't in the cost of service study that we were siphoning $8 million off the water transfer. So that was that. Now, to breach, and this is more for the board because I don't think it's fair to ask Chuck, but in the water community, we were told for years, from 98 on, the protection we had was using the Met escalator. Rodney Smith, David Osias, the Dream Team that's now supported by Menville, Mendoza, and Garber, always knew that that was an escalator in our favor. When Brady, who's now on the import committee in San Diego, recently discussed DeMars having a job here, he was assured by another person in the San Diego board that none of Chuck's money could come from any of San Diego's money. So things that are going on that escalator that we then changed is the third thing that second thing that San Diego changed from an agreed upon agreement. One was the local entity, which John Carter assured the community could add up to $120 million. Shortly after we signed the deal, they said we have to go to arbitration. They threatened lawsuits on it. In my mind, that was a threatening breach. The escalator is a threatening breach because if we would have the escalator, we'd be looking at different numbers now. We would looking at numbers that might make the San Diego transfer look better. This board, and Anthony, for you and all these details you want, this board allowed Brady to do that without one workshop, without any of the public acknowledging what was in the IID's best interest to have him settle that privately. Amen. So when we go through this in the future, let's make sure the board does its business transparently. Whether any input from the board went to DeMars, I know input from this board goes to David Osias. It goes there privately. It goes there individually. So if you're going to have a board policy where you don't do things individually, then you need to look for those details, Anthony, and see if you can bring it forward. Now, on the state board, I asked this board the same question. I'll let Chuck think about it. As you go to ask them to put in this mitigation water and exchange it for cash, please think about conserving the cash for IID's purposes. Do not donate it to the JPA. The JPA has a firm member from the state of California who now has veto power over anything that IID might have to do to protect itself. So if you monetize that water, do not hand it over to San Diego, Coachella, and the state. That would be a lack of a fiduciary responsibility to the irrigators and the beneficiaries you have here. So if your board will give the ability for Chuck to guard that or watch that, I'd be interested to hear his opinion on whether that should be our water given to money that's given to a committee, that we're 1/4 vote with the state having a veto power. The definite plan. When you guys went through the definite plan, you went through one issue on the definite plan, which was the seepage conservation, which then Dr. Eckhart turned into his $380 million definite plan. Not one time, Anthony, did any of you guys ask for details on that. You did your seepage recovery, which I thought was X amount of millions. The next thing you were told is the resolution committed you to the definite plan. So you've got to look at your actions. You've got to take this advice. If you don't correct your actions, the advice is not going to be worthwhile, even if it's correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan.
Yeah,
Anybody
Mr. Morgan?
else? Anybody else?
I just wanted to make a comment about the seepage recovery. There was an effort, I know I brought it forward, to do a cost-benefit analysis, which is part of the responsibility that you'll find in our governance manual. and was told that you couldn't do a cost-benefit analysis on it. But that seems to be exactly what Mr. DeMars is doing.
Guys, Dr. Sanchez.
Yeah, the detailed plan for the definite plan for $300 million was the reservoirs, the laterals, what Dr. Eckhart, his salary that some people in here don't necessarily like. That's a detailed plan. That's what I was looking for today is, okay, if you don't like that, the reservoirs, the canals, the line, all that stuff, the seepage plan, if you don't like that, what do you propose? So we can see whether it'll work. So to come in and say it's not going to work, I think is unfair to staff, 1,300 employees who put a lot of time and effort into our organization. And that was what I'm looking for out of this presentation.
Okay. Chuck, do you have any follow-up right now? Because otherwise I'll finish up with board member comments.
No, I don't have any follow-up. I was asked, Oscar gave me a question here. He asked the question, why did the Court of Appeals rule that the state wasn't obligated to pay for all of the mitigation costs and cleaning up the Salton Sea? And the simple answer is they concluded that that the state could not be forced to spend money to clean up the Salton Sea under the Constitution.
Right. Dr. Hanks, go ahead.
I would just kind of like to wrap this part up by making a couple of comments. One, I like the suggestion, the recommendation that Mr. DeMars made on the 417-1600, with the caveat that Mr. Jordan brought forward. I think when we move forward on this, we need to be careful that we start closing up some of the wounds that exist in this process. The litigation that you talked about and the communication factor, if we don't handle that correctly, it will be an issue. Because there was a 417, a wasting issue, and there was a flooding issue. And I'd like to see us move to the point exactly what Mr. Jordan was talking about, that we have become efficient, and that changes a different setting. At the same time, we can't forget now that we're in a squeeze between the Bureau of Reclamation, where they were coming from, and where the EPA is coming now. We're caught in a vice. Two federal entities putting a squeeze on us on a political judgment that determines they need our water. It's not the best business practice for us to just go with their political judgments on that. But also because of the balance sheets and what we're seeing there, I would like to see the conservation, both the system and on farm, brought in-house. I think we have people on board that has years of experience. And whenever you talk about theory and you talk about the reality of the type of ground we have and the soils and so forth, you have to spend time out there. And I think we have the proper staff to do that. With the financial, with the business case, with the state stepping back, that creates a whole new big challenge. And I think with the environmental issues, if we're left to handle the brunt of that, we'll never be able to conserve the amount of water that we need to meet the obligation of the QSA, because there's just not going to be enough finances there to get the job done. So that's going to take some planning, how we handle that, who steps up to the plate, or whether we just sit back and keep quiet, and then the next thing you know, the EPA is down on us, the way we farm, the way we drive up and down the dirt roads, the way business people other than ag, the changes they have to make are going to be affected. And we need to guard against that. From the point of the finances, I think the board has made a step in the right direction by separating out the accounts, where we can keep track of the revenue flow and the expenses. So I'm, maybe late, but we're moving that way. The issue of the baseline, I think, is going to create a big problem. Probably because you didn't want to say it, but whenever you start talking about a baseline, and you alluded to it a little bit, you have some growers that already moved that direction, already implementing some standards. So if the baseline isn't fair and equitable, they're going to be punished, and they're probably the most efficient growers in the bunch that are moving that direction. So what we could be doing is then paying for less efficient conservation measures, and that can create wounds, and as far as fairness. I don't know how you go about that, whether you change the terms. We kicked around some issues that would require some new negotiations, whether it's in the form of the old PIC program, and whether we can get buy-in from the water agencies. But that's going to create a challenge in itself. But I think the most important message that I heard today was that we're not going to get there if we don't start communicating. We have too many issues, and if we rely on litigation, particularly those who don't live here that are litigating on our behalf, making decisions, because we can't talk here and get this resolved, then I don't think there's any hope for us. And whether the transfer has to be implemented, I think that was decided a long time ago. But the fact whether it is a benefit or not hasn't been decided, and we have to make sure that it is a benefit, and that the finances on this issue make sense. As you know, I've been looking at this for some time, and I couldn't make it come out. And now, with the realization of the mitigation issue on top of it, it really creates a burden for the IID. And I thank you for your presentation.
Okay. Stella, do you have any comments?
Yes, I do. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Damaris for your presentation. As the only board member on this board that did not vote for the water transfer, I think we're stuck with the responsibility of going forward with the water transfer, because I, for one, will not break a contract. I will not do that. But that is not to say we can't work with the other agencies to make it better. I like your recommendation about the district and the county and the air pollution control district working better together. I think that's very important that we do that. Your comment about the IID working with the farming community is also important, because they have to conserve the water. One of the reasons that I did not vote for the water transfer years back is because I felt that they were trying to push it in a manner that did not give our board a full chance to kind of anticipate what the consequences could be. And I felt that we needed more time. If they had given us a few more weeks to analyze it and read it more carefully, it would have been better. But I guess some of our board members felt threatened. Maybe they felt, what is the word I want to say? Getting calls from, what's the name of that guy with the short guy with the boots and the cowboy hat? What's his name? Bennett Rayleigh. Having Bennett Rayleigh call him on their cell phone kind of made him feel special. I don't know. At that time, I knew that they were not going to threaten me. I knew where I stood, and I stayed here today as well. I don't feel threatened by anybody. I don't feel threatened by San Diego or Met or whatever, but I do know that we need to work together, and this is probably the only chance we'll have to do that. So as this water districts and as representing the ratepayers of Imperial Valley, it's important that we take this document and try to make this transfer a better transfer. But at the same time, I'm not going to blow it up. No way in hell am I going to blow it up, because that would expose the district to far more dangers than what we have right now.
Thank you, Stella. Director Desert.
Thank you, Chuck, for your presentation today. And Director Hanks is correct. He did some backwards math. Him and his brother Orby worked on the QSA, and he came out with what he called a negative business model, whereas the more water we transfer, the more it costs us. And I think that's what we're hearing today from Mr. DeMars and his crew, looking at over $1 billion deficit of the QSA as we move forward over time. With that said, we look at what we've done in court. We've won in court. The idea is won, but what have we won? We argued a point that the state, in fact, doesn't have a financial obligation that they're going to live up to. But we can't call it a breach until we get to that deficit in our actual accounting. So we're not going to be able to call it a breach until the way our mentality is now, until we go into the future and reach that point. Well, that's really kind of crazy. That's really kind of crazy. And I encourage the board to rethink their positions. Even board members that were on the board at the time that didn't vote for the QSA. We've learned an awful lot over the last 10, 11 years of the QSA, as normally human beings and committees and boards should. And in regards to negotiations, we didn't see any negotiations making the QSA a better deal during the appeals process. What we saw was negotiations between Bureau and Met that didn't realize any functioning changes to the QSA. It was just dogma. It was just bureaucratic talk. And that was supposed to be part of the appeals. We didn't get anything out of it. We talk about negotiation. Some of us even campaigned on it, renegotiate the QSA, and we're condemned for that. Now you'll hear that being a common mantra, renegotiate this thing, do it. But what have we done? What we do fight in court is we fought to say that the state doesn't have an obligation. Your report points it out. It's easy to follow in your report, even though it is complicated. It's much more easy to follow than the QSA document itself. It is disappointing that the Dream Team isn't here to view this and see this. We'll get their feedback, I'm sure, in another meeting. If this QSA is a bad thing and the escalators have been negotiated out of it for other entities' benefits at the compromise to the IID, we got to remember all those things, every little step like that where we've missed the boat along the way. It's a terrible situation where the community is ripped apart, where there's a lawsuit between Imperial County and the IID. We never should have been there. With that said, we got to stop this fight. It shouldn't be looked at as blowing up the QSA. It should be looked at as calling it for what it is. And if it is currently in a breach, then it's a breach. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Desert. Okay, Chuck, I appreciate you coming in. You know, this board called for you to come in and kind of give us a second opinion, plan B, on looking at the QSA. And I think you've done an outstanding job. You're going to have a final report. I think the important thing is that you're willing to work with this board and on a petition, go back to State Water Resource Control Board, take another look at Decision 1600, I believe it's.
Is there another question? Otra vez, el Oscar.
Mr. Kelly, did you want to make a comment?
I only wanted to remind the board that Mr. DeMars and his firm, in fact, are assisting IID on a going forward basis with the petition.
Right.
And for the record, the state does not have veto power.
I don't think that.
Yeah, and Chuck, you know, you're from New Mexico. Right. That's a good thing. You're not from the coast. And you worked with irrigators back in New Mexico, I think in 2 different water departments that you serve.
We have 2 irrigation districts, and there's an Oscar in each one of them. Just
Would you like a third one?
No.
You have a Steve Scaroni in any of it.
Oscar has his job right here, and he's doing a good job.
I'm a gymnasiast.
But anyway, I appreciate you coming out.
Glad to be here.
And we're looking forward to your final report. And we're looking forward to you to work with the Water Conservation Advisory Board and on trying to rework the definite plan, and also on a petition. And so, Jesse, do you have any comments, Jesse Silva, on this?
Just to say that I'm glad to report that we are starting to do some of the things that Chuck has proposed, working with the Water Conservation Advisory Board and internalizing the definite plan, as Director Hanks says as well. So we're in concert with what he's saying.
All right. Okay, we're going to take a break. Thank you. We're going to
see you later.
Change the order of the agenda just for one item because Mr. Courier has to go back to San Diego, and we're going to jump to one action item, which is going to be number 10, adoption of resolution delegating authority to the general manager on hiring/termination of executive staff. And when we're done with that action item, we're going to go back to information to start with number 6. Okay, we need, somebody would see if Director Desert's out there.
You have me. Let's go.
Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. You have a redraft of the resolution that you looked at last week. Hopefully it incorporates most of your major concerns. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
What is this?
It's number 10. We're going to action. Number 10 on page 88.
Oh, because you don't look like Joe Lively.
I have a question for you, Mr. Courier.
Sure.
On
88?
On page 92, code 53262, where it says other similar chief administrative officer or chief executive officer of a local agency shall be ratified in an open session. Okay.
That only applies where the governing board itself takes action to ratify. It does not preclude a delegation of authority.
Okay. Now, does this resolution then, with expenditures over 200,000, does this give the general manager authorization over 200,000?
The answer to your question is, I believe, handled by paragraph number 7. If that means it goes over 200,000, it would depend on what's in your other policy that I don't have in front of me.
They would still then be in place, right?
I didn't hear the question.
They would still be in place.
The other policy is still in place.
Okay, thank you. Make the motion to approve.
A second?
Okay, is there any discussion by the board? Any discussion from the public? Please vote. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go back thank you for all your work, Mr. Courier. We're going to go back to the information. That is we're going to go to energy number 6, update on affected system studies. That's on page 37. Mr. Ivy, you're up.
Joel Ivy, Interim Energy Manager. Thank you, President Manville, Board of Directors. Want to have a continuing dialogue. This time we'll be talking about the affected system studies. Run through a quick kind of synopsis of generally what it is. An affected system study is very much like any other system impact study that we might conduct when generators want to interconnect in or near our system. In this particular case, generators would be looking to interconnect, I'll say near our system, but not necessarily directly to it. So, for example, the generators that are connecting directly into the Imperial Valley substation would be causing an effect on our system, or at least worthy of making a study to determine whether or not they do have an effect on our system. Right now, we have, there's a myriad projects in the California ISO queue. What we have in our direct line of sight is roughly 8 developments in various stages of study as we speak. We have essentially 4 developers that have completed studies. The total amount of generation that are in this mix is roughly 2,485 megawatts. There is more than that in the ISOQ, but bear in mind, this is an attempt to get power flowing on the Sunrise Power Link, which is thermal loading limited to about 1,500 megawatts. So just want to do a quick overview for the area that we're talking about specifically. In the bottom of the map, you can see the blue line running east and west. That's the 500 kV line, the SWIPL, the Southwest Power Link, that we are roughly 200 megawatt capacity participants in. That runs from the Palo Verde Hasayampa switchyard area all the way around to the Imperial Valley substation, and then ultimately on into to the San Diego area. So the generators are connecting. I'll go to the next slide. The generators here, you can kind of see a smattering of pins. The Director Desert, thank you. This is Google Earth, another good application for that. So I dropped a pin approximately where these generators are going to be located. This is not intended to be.
Area right here?
Thank you. Thank you. And out to the left a little bit, Director Mendoza.
Your left or my left?
Your left. Yeah, right up along the freeway. There's a wind energy project up at the top there, and then there's a smattering of solar right around the Imperial Valley substation. There's a pin down in Mexico, just in that hill range in the very center bottom of the diagram.
I can't see it. You want to use my phone? Give it back. Or?
Right there. And then further out east, there's another 290 megawatt project that is part of this queue. So the sum total of all of these together, including the ones that we know about very well that are interconnecting directly to Imperial Valley substation, again, is roughly 2,485 megawatts. When we conduct these studies, we use several different scenarios that we take a look at. We do what we call N-0. Everything is just fine, running as it should, all lines in service, all lines and equipment. We do an N-1, which means we pick some suspected facilities or lines. We take them out of service, and then we model what the impact would be. We step on through to an N-2, which is just double that. And it can be any combination of two that could cause system impacts. We also look at these scenarios in heavy summer loading conditions, and very often we have more issues in light winter with flow trying to go in and around or through our system because we don't have the load for generation to sync to necessarily. We look at the ratings of the lines and the equipment, make sure we're not exceeding any system operating limits or equipment limits, and then we also look at emergency ratings and limitations on the lines and facilities. We have some scenarios that the district is aware of, and we call these reliability related issues. These are issues that we're in some stage of mitigation ourselves, and we don't usually pile these on the backs of somebody that's looking to interconnect, be it inside our system or outside our system. If it's a long-term type view of a contingency issue that we have, we could make the assessment and assign it to these generators. By and large, if it's within a few years or even less than 10, we would do it ourselves. The projects that we looked at, they're outside our system. We also can take a look at these incrementally, one at a time, or we can take a look at these as a cluster. And most recently, we took a look at these last remaining projects around the Imperial Valley substation as a cluster. So the way to mitigate system impacts, depending on the amount or the size of the impact to our system, can range from operational procedures, which is where the system operator at the SOC would be given a set of steps to run through to mitigate whatever the situation may be. So we would consider that low risk and actually low likelihood of occurring. All these studies that we run are based on worst case scenarios. We can install remedial action schemes or special protection schemes, the infamous RAS, or we can require network upgrades to be done. Again, all of this is dependent on the amount of penetration of the generation impact into our system. Looking on this particular sheet, there's two different scenarios that I just want to bring out that are relatively typical. One of these is the 290 megawatt project that was going to be interconnecting. This is out around Dateland. You can kind of get a sense in the column that's marked pre. That's more or less the N minus zero. Very few infractions on our system because of that. In the right-hand column under the outage description, that is what we would take out of service to model a contingency in our system. And then in the the next to the last left-hand column and the next couple over kind of describes the facilities that would be impacted by that event. So on the very top line, you can see that we have an Avenue 58 transformer, and the outage on the far right-hand side is a transmission line, a transformer 161 to 92 kV transformer. So the precondition is 98%, and with no upgrades, it would cause an overload of 101. It's a relatively minor infraction. The transformers, we can go emergency overloads to 110%, for example. So we still have some room to be able to mitigate these kinds of things. The column that you see marked in red is with the IV Dixieland improvements in service. Yeah, with IV Dixieland in, it changes the flows on our system a little bit because we're adding a new source. So you would expect that it would. And you can kind of get a sense that it also adds to the flows in the system, to the percentages that are shown in that column. Those are what I would call manageable situations. But then again, these are all based on the reliability improvements that we're making, and in this particular case, we would not saddle the interconnecting generators with the cost of those system upgrades. In that particular scenario, they're all related to the 92 kV. Well, almost all of these are related to the 92 kV R line, which runs out by the Naval Air Facility. So the mitigating factor for that is a project that we've had on the plate for a while, but we haven't pulled the trigger on, which is to increase the wire size for that particular circuit. That project would be on us to do. So the second typical project that we model is a 200 megawatt project. This is in a different cluster. By the way, the very first one was one that we studied independently, the top box, and then the second one is one that we studied in conjunction with a cluster type group. So the important column in that second box is right in the very middle. You see a box marked all C1, C2, no upgrades. We're seeing quite an impact to the system that requires mitigation from the interconnecting generators. In particular, in this one, we're requiring that these generators that are coming in together would upgrade a transformer at the El Centro switching station and a transformer at Coachella Valley. These are 161 kV to 92 kV transformers. Those are the ones that are seeing the problems. Some of the others that you can kind of see that are showing up, they may be related to projects that we already have in service or about to, like the additional transformer we're adding at Avenue 58. That the red lines that are associated with that will be mitigated when we get that transformer in service, which should be in a month to have that done. I'm going about this way just to show the typical process for how we get through in the decision making in assigning network upgrade costs or system operating procedures or SPS as the protection mechanisms. If there's going to be a gap, if a network upgrade is required and there's going to be a gap in the time that the network upgrade comes online to when the project comes in service, then we would also require a system operating procedure or an SPS depending on the size of the infraction. So sometimes it's a double whammy. What we saw from our system impact studies for the affected systems, the transitional cluster projects presented fairly manageable impacts. And please bear in mind, too, that the addition of the Sunrise Power Link and a new transformer, Bank 82 at the Imperial Valley Substation, have a significant change in the power flow characteristics in the southern part of the state down there, which impacts us, but it also tends to make the power want to flow to San Diego instead of how it is now. We tend to want to push power through the IID system from the IV Gen, the generators that are down in Mexico that are already existing. So the advent of the Sunrise Power Link tends to want to pull more of that power towards San Diego. The CAISO Cluster 1 and 2 projects, the later ones that we're studying now, are tending to present more network-related issues, and we are going to go after these generators for the cost of these network upgrades.
That was my next question. How are you going to mitigate these impacts?
We're going to require that these generators pay for the improvements to the system for the impacts that they're causing. We've got, working with Debbie Swanstrom in Washington, D.C., we've got a pretty exhaustive agreement in place that will cover the district to make sure that these get in service.
Do these also include the projects that we're talking about that would cross the West Side Main Canal?
Yes, ma'am.
How can you force them to pay for to mitigate the upgrades?
Because they're impacting our system when they connect to IV sub.
So when do you bring these impacts to? How do you mitigate them before you sign the contract? After you sign the contract?
It has nothing to do with it. It's a totally separate issue from.
So signature of the contracts does have no bearing on what you're telling me
When
right
we
now
do a
under the
system
impacts?
when we do a system impact study, we make them sign an agreement agreeing to mitigate their impacts in the way that we determine. And we memorialize that in what's called a system impact agreement or affected system agreement.
Okay.
Which is new. This is a new process for us, and we're kind of feeling this out as we go, but we've not really had to do this before. And generally, you might think that we would go to the ISO for remedies in these situations. In this particular case, it's getting to be so widespread that the ISO and we've just kind of agreed to go straight to the generators and get this done.
Dr. Hanks, you have a question? You want to wait till he's done?
He's done.
Well, I just wanted to point out, as we continue to study more bypass, it's obviously going to drive the need for more network upgrades because the projects that we're seeing now are presenting issues. And to the extent we connect more, it's going to continue to present issues that we'll have to mitigate.
Okay, Director Hanks, you had questions on this.
What is the rule if you set them independently? It's almost like the last drop that causes the glass to overflow. So if you study it independently, like the cluster, the transitional cluster, there's more units or more megawatts, but yet the impacts aren't as great as the next one. Well, it seemed like you'd have to stay them together in fairness to them and their cost sharing of the impacts. But we know there's more to come. Even on top of that, now the next one in line, maybe it's transformers. And I had a couple other questions, but it just, we know that there's been a study out there, or a request for a study. We know about how many megawatts. Okay, so if we don't hold them responsible for the impacts on our grid, then our developers that are going to connect to the IID grid, okay, are then overburdened and have to pay for even more upgrades when they're hooking into our system. I just don't see quite how that fits together.
Well, the art of this, and it really is an art, is to make sure that you're fairly assessing chicken and egg. Who comes first? In this particular case, we don't have any real knowns, or we don't have a lot of knowns from our transitional cluster that we studied. So we had to say, okay, based on when these projects want to come in service, this is when we're going to place them in. And I don't know that there's any developers online in that base case study that we did internal to IID that's not already online.
Let me ask it this way. The developers that are in our queue, has their impacts already been studied and been assessed accordingly? Or are they going to be pancaked on top of these guys? I mean, where are they at in this pancaking scheme here?
That's a dirty word. The developers that are in our queue and that we've already studied have been studied, and the impacts that we've assessed to them, let me rephrase that, the ones that are in our queue are being studied, but they're on top of the ones that have already been studied. That's just how the process goes. So that is kind of the pancaking effect of that. To the extent we can take advantage of any latent capacity, we certainly will. But these guys are coming along. They're wanting to come in service in a different date and time, and that's when we will plug them into the system and study them for that point. So these guys, for example, are the two transformers that I'm talking about could actually be picked up by the transitional cluster, but they're being picked up by these guys because they're coming in service first.
Okay, let me take it a step further. Currently, we have about 450 megawatts of geothermal going up the KNKS line. That line was financed by the generators. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So there's additional megawatts capacity on that line, somewhat, and we're looking at upgrades. But will these projects that are not interconnected to the ID, will there be inadvertent flows coming into our system that utilizes that capacity on that line, which they had no involvement, no revenue to help pay for it? This is an inadvertent flow going from the IB sub, from one Cal ISO line to another one at Cal Edison. We're transporting with no wheeling plus line losses. We get to pay for the line losses, no wheeling. So from my standpoint, if we're looking at the impacts to the system, why don't we look at some type of infrastructure so we don't have these inadvertent flows in us, that their energy flows to where it's intended, which is San Diego?
Couple of points on that, and I want to go back to what I said about the Sunrise Power Link line. That is, right now we have the tendency for the power to want to flow north, and it's hindering our ability to generate RA. I think that is widely known at Imperial Valley. When we bring the Sunrise line bring it in service, it's going to change the dynamics of the flow quite a bit. So I think what we're going to see is quite a bit of mitigation just by virtue of that happening. We're going to have inadvertent flow. Our schedules never match our actuals, and nobody's do. So there's always going to be that extent of it. And I think the key here is that 600 megawatts that we have available on Path 42 today is a scheduling capacity right, and we can schedule right up to 600 megawatts. And if by virtue of somebody else coming along, they're increasing flows on that to where it's out of bounds, so to speak, then they're responsible to have to mitigate those upgrades. And right now today, we're not really seeing that.
Those are in reserve, basically, then. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they're something we factor in when we study the system from a reliability standpoint, but they don't have title to our transmission.
So let's say that currently,
unless they schedule it. Excuse me.
Okay, I'm saying currently, let's say we have a 100 megawatts of inadvertent flow coming through Dixieland, IB Dixieland direction. Okay, with the additional development, that's going to put a higher burden, a higher inadvertent flow on us. Okay, if it goes, say, to 200 megawatts, and I don't know whether to handle that line would handle that, but and if our system losses from, and I'm getting this number from the budget, is 12.3%. If we have to assume that loss, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars a year that's been put onto the IID. So when I'm thinking of impacts, I'm not technically minded to understand the breakers and the relays and so forth. I just look at the bottom line, the dollar. How is that mitigated?
You're right about one thing. This is very complex. We have the scheduling right for 168 megawatts up the S line into our system off the SWIPL. So to the extent we're fully utilizing that, we're good. If we have inadvertent flows on our system, depending on the loading scenarios that we have, that inadvertent flow is probably going to work out, unless it's serving to overload some of our equipment, which is when we pick up the phone and tell them to cut it out. We can also receive the benefit of that syncing to our load. So it's not necessarily just a straight pass-through on Path 42, for example. It's quite possible that inadvertent flow is replacing some scheduled power that we may not be able to get the electrons from San Juan. So we'll take that inadvertent flow and just sync it straight to our load. Everybody does it with the power that we have, so we all live to fight another day. So,
but we then have to generate it, push it out, balance it out.
Well, we have to balance your schedules, absolutely, with your load.
And do we do that with our generators, or can we purchase replacement?
Both.
Both.
Real time is going to be using our generators. That's just too quick of a response time.
Okay. Well, the main thing that I want to make sure is that our system is protected, and I don't feel real comfortable with the RAS, the remedial. What is that?
Remedial action scheme.
I don't know whether just throttling back on those generators is going to protect us. I think it's going to take some type of infrastructure, and if that's the case, I want it to be mitigated in the correct fashion, and if it means extra bucks for the generators, they're the ones causing the impact on it.
Yeah. So what? It's not my problem. If they're causing the impact, they should have to pay the way. We are taking a look at that RAS. There has been a push from the ISO from San Diego to look at doing away with it. And my comment to the people that are participating in this little committee is out of my cold dead hands. Right now, that's the one thing that's protecting our system from outages and that power wanting to flow through our system and overload our transformers and whatnot. So it does need to be smarter. It was a fairly unsophisticated scheme that was put in the first place. It worked. That's not very comforting, but it worked. But we can install more recently dated equipment and make that perform quite a bit better and maintain a solid layer of protection for our system.
Okay. Do we ever ask non-IID generators that are hooked to our grid to adjust their production to accommodate flows from the outside?
You mean like the Cal Energies of the world? And
right.
We generally don't do that. We don't have much of a market here to compensate for that. We tend to balance with our own units.
Okay. All right. I think you already know where I stand. I don't have to repeat that, So, but I would really expect this to come forward. Have the general manager bring it to us and explain this to us, and make sure that we're covered as part of this agreement as we move along. I know it's separate from the from the MOU and from the developer agreements, but, we'd like for it to be considered separate.
That'll be April 3rd, subject to the call of the president. But it would not only be those two contracts, those documents that are already in play, but this affected system study. And we'll get that to the board along with some sort of executive summary well in advance of that meeting's agenda.
Yeah, Dr.
I
Mendoza.
have a question. I'm still a bit confused. If the IID is commissioning these studies, how can you force the generators to pay for them if they didn't ask for the studies? What do you have? What hammer do you have to make them pay?
We have a limit of the amount of flow that we can have into our system with the ISO. And so there's a mitigation that somebody has to do. And so San Diego, the ISO, everybody knows how this
So
game
even
is
though
played.
they didn't ask for the study, we can force them to mitigate it?
The generator has to be able to check that box in order to go forward.
Yes.
Well, one last thing. On our build-out, we're going to have to deal with Cal Edison, okay? And I don't know whether we have in this study whether it involves them, but this could be having an impact on their lines. And so whenever we go in production on the IID grid with the local developers, then they could be asked to carry the burden. They could put the burden on our developers that are hooked to our grid instead of the ones that's hooked into their grid.
That would that be via the S line up to KNKS? Is that what he's talking about?
With the ultimate build out, you talk about changing the dynamics of power flow in the region. When we build the ultimate north to south 230 kV path, that's going to change the dynamics of the power flow. The ISO is studying maximum import capabilities coming out of the district. And they've studied and we're pushing them to continue to study about 1,500 megawatts, as much as we possibly can get them to. So Edison, San Diego, a couple of years, I think it's 2 years out, the ISO is saying it doesn't matter where it's going, north or south, that's still the ISO, and they need to be ready to receive it. So it was one at Path 42, and it was one at Imperial Valley Substation. Going forward, it's just going to be to the ISO interconnection point. They need to be ready to receive the amount of power that we can send out.
Well, I just want to make sure that we're not putting extra costs on our local developers that would affect their PPAs and put them out of competitive range again.
Yeah, I get your point. I think what we'll have to do is on April 3rd be prepared to respond to the Edison piece of this.
Thank you.
Oh, that's a good point. That's what I was leading to. Don't penalize the few that we have PPAs with the IID.
Dr. Sanchez, you have any questions? Dr.
Yeah.
Blizzard?
Joel, where is Bank 82? That's on the last page of this, the second bullet on this page 7 of your presentation.
Right. There's a couple of transformers in service at Imperial Valley Substation. Bank 80 is the one that we have titled to a certain amount of capacity, which is roughly 168 megawatts. Then you have Bank 81, which we do not have capacity rights in. Bank 82 is actually sitting on the ground out there, waiting to go in service with the advent of the Sunrise line.
That's another 168 megawatts?
Oh, that's I can't remember how big it is, but it's huge.
Is that the bay that we reserved?
Well, that was a breaker position to be able to get a transmission line to the bus, to the 230 kV bus.
Okay.
But the extra capacity allows for import-export benefits.
But that the particular bank that's identified at the Sunrise Power Link is the one that's going to be impacted by this example of what the study has told us.
The network impact that I was speaking about earlier is actually in our El Centro switching station and in our Coachella station.
Yeah.
So it's in our system.
And you mentioned earlier that you had been talking with the people from Mexico on the Rositas that they wanted to get rid of that existing RAS agreement, that old RAS agreement. Is it? And you disagreed with them. Mm-hmm. But when they were talking to you about getting rid of it, did they talk to you about doing any financial infrastructure upgrades to our system in lieu, or they just wanted to get rid of the RAS?
it seems to be the belief that that the bringing in the Sunrise Line is going to fairly mitigate all that, and I just don't believe it.
Oh, and then the studies that we've seen so far, we've had ongoing discussion about the $26 million infrastructure from the Ivy Sub Dixie connection there. Have any of these studies indicated that that's where some of their mitigation money needs to go, or has it all been identified more internally within the IID grid?
Right. That particular project was seen as a reliability improvement to the IID grid to have a backup to the S line, for example, and so that would not be the generators, internal or external, would not be saddled with that cost.
Yeah, and then before we have the meeting on the 3rd, and we will get the reports before that. Can you tell us today if there's any financial mitigation requirements for the C Solar or the LS projects that we're contemplating at this time? Do they have a clean bill of health?
No, there's mitigations.
And they're aware of that?
Oh, yes.
And those go back to the El Centro switching station?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just interesting, and I just someday I hope I can understand how mitigation out at Mount Signal requires upgrades all the way at the El Centro switching station.
All the way up to Coachella.
All the way up to Coachella.
Mm-hmm.
So there is some impacts from those projects that we'll be discussing in the near future meeting.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's the same as in development. Your signal lights could be 6 miles away if you've got a lot of traffic for development. So you got to put a signal light. It's the same thing.
Well, you take the project that I mentioned that was out by Dateland. We see impacts. I mean, you saw that box. They're small and they can be managed, but nonetheless, they're impacts.
Dateland, you're talking out the west side of the valley?
Out towards
out by the Dixie.
Gila Bend, out that way in Arizona.
Okay.
That's where the dairies are. Steve Benson, did you have a question? Are you really 6 foot, 7 foot tall?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get a taller mic. Sorry. Con permiso, yo soy un ingeniero civil y no es un ingeniero electricidad. Tengo una idea y muchas preguntas. That's my best Spanish. I look at this really as a traffic model. When I was a civil engineer, I put together a lot of traffic models that you're essentially dealing with traffic jams, and that's kind of what you alluded to there. I do have a lot of questions, and one is, do you pay for the inadvertent load that comes across the system, or is it free power that's generated?
It's either shipped through our system or it's replacing power that we otherwise can't get because where we're trying to get it from is so far away.
So
like
pay
San
someone
Juan.
else?
No. We still pay for who we schedule from,
Okay.
and you just take the benefit of the invertent flow.
Okay. And then as far as the 8-minute energy project at the conference, they're talking about a lot of the things north of Calipat. Is there capacity there, or is that the new capacity that you're talking about going to the north?
The ultimate capacity is what we got to keep in mind is roughly 1,400 to 1,500 megawatts that's flowing out the Sunrise Line. That's the added capacity that San Diego is putting to the system. So the maximum amount that they could hope for should be in and around that number. Where it comes from is still being determined.
Because I know 8-minute was talking about all their grand projects throughout the county, and I don't know how many of those are reality or not. I don't know, Mr. Kelly, if you can.
Yeah, I think that they have the largest number of land positions.
Right.
So they're geographically scattered throughout the valley,
Right.
including in our system.
No, I just know a lot of people in Calipat don't really understand that north of Calipat it could be a sea of solar if they get their way.
That would be ideal from our vantage point.
Okay. Right, because they're within the network. The last thing is it falls back to water, and it's been brought up that the QSA was set up as using pump back ponds, and I know you're talking about transmission, but my understanding is there's not even capacity in the grid to service all the pump back ponds that were anticipated. If we set up electrical ponds, so then the question is, with air quality, could we set up any other type of pumping mechanisms? I know we've looked at it for our ranches. We have a few that we've paid for, and we were told that we can't get credits for them. So it's just a question of a lot of farmers out there. That is a simple solution to save water. I don't know if that's even been studied within the grid, but it'd be something that, I was trying to work with Jesse on the Water Conservation Board, and now I had to step off because I'm a candidate, but I'd still like to go to the meetings and track that because I think it's an important thing for everyone that they can utilize going forward.
Are you talking about added electrical infrastructure in the country because of these solar projects, so there's not such a high cost to establish the transmission to the pump back systems?
Well, it's more the pump back systems themselves. I know that we wanted to run a power line a mile. It was going to be $400,000. I mean, the pump itself is only $20,000. So why would we spend that for a power line? A lot of other guys have the same things where there's not a pump back pond on the end of their field. And if they wanted to run a power line, there is no grid out there to support that. And then as far as all the flows would happen at different times of the day, and you could not calculate when that would happen, and it would throw your system way off. If you have 20 people,
that's never been studied. And that's
okay. Well, that's a question because
problem.
If the QSA is supporting that angle,
no, the QSA got founded off of pump back systems when they signed the contract with San Diego in '98. Started with
right. And how do you power those with electricity?
They weren't looking at that. They just figured that doing pump backs cost $258 an acre foot, and they went with it.
And so that's the model that we have built, but no one's ever studied.
Yeah,
it's
that's why it's important.
Another thing that's never been
Jesse
studied.
starts reworking a definite plan.
Okay. Well, it's been 8.5 years. I think you've had time to study it. So thanks.
Okay. Anything else? Because we got to keep moving here. Why don't you roll into general matters, Mr. Ivy? If you have any. If not, you can sit down.
Just sit out is the preference. Just a real quick kudos to Raquel Lopez and her staff, specifically Susie Carrillo and Rosa Maria Gonzalez for their work on supporting the Renewable Energy Summit. Rosa Maria sat on the IVDC committee to get that work done. I thought they did a fantastic job.
She did it. They all did an outstanding job.
All of them did an outstanding job.
Okay. We're going to go into water, number 8, local entity. So Lynn and Vince and Gustavo, you're up.
Good afternoon. We're here to present the RFP and the supporting documentation for the 2012 non-competitive fouling mitigation program. You'll find all the documents in your board packet. The RFP starts it off, and then all the supporting crop estimates for 3 years. Also, on the front page, you'll see the dollar amounts for each year that we're going to be mitigating for. Glenn is going to give a brief presentation on the changes that we made to the RFP for this go-round and the ways we tried to tighten it up. And then also, we've developed a kind of a mini program that's going to take a lot of the guesswork, and it's going to clean up the application process a little bit, and they're going to go through that real briefly. Then after that, we'll take questions, and then our plan is to bring it back on the 3rd for approval, along with several other issues in the competitive program.
Okay, Glenn.
Thank you. Our panel got together and met several times to discuss the local entity and the application and the program that we have this time, and how could we improve it from the experience, shall we say, that we had last time. Up on the screen is a sample, and I'm sure you folks have looked over the request for a proposal. One of the requirements that we're making this time is that the forms will be completed on an Excel program, and they will be submitted. We'll receive both paper forms, and we will receive them on a flash drive. And the purpose of this is to cut down on the time and the effort that it takes to go through and review these forms. I think just about everybody should have access to a computer and to the Excel program. If they don't, perhaps they can check with their children, their grandchildren,
Don't be talking about me now.
And if push comes to shove, they can call my office and make an appointment and come up there to my office, and we'll crank the things out there. This form, one of the benefits of it is it also takes away, should reduce the chance for errors. For example, here on this form, where we're looking at, what is it, 10, 11? 10, 11, and what, Acacia 4. And by just simply checking the box of the applications that would be applicable to this, it will calculate and extend the numbers in automatically over in the right.
That's really cool.
It.
I didn't know you had that much talent, Mr. Sampson.
Ma'am, sir.
I didn't realize you had that much talent.
I don't necessarily do, other than unless you consider the fact that I know other people who do, and I can blackmail. Call on them. If for example we pick a wrong year or a particular field that was not, it will give you an error message over under total impact value. It won't add up to anything. This list came from the IID's website on what fields were fouled in what year. We think this will cut down.
So that information is correct and up to the date.
As far as we know, Gustavo has looked at it, I've looked at it, Vince has looked at it. As far as we know, it is correct.
Okay.
We will hand out the programs. We propose to hand out the programs on flash drives. IT department doesn't particularly want people being able to do this online on the IID system, so we can hand out these little flash drives. They're cheap enough. Okay. If you folks have any questions, we'll try to answer them.
No, I think you guys have done a good job reworking this thing.
I looked over this pretty close. I only had a couple of questions. One, on the auditing procedure, probably should have an agreement how you're going to handle that when you have the RFPs that go out. Or there was some hard feelings about who was selected and the reasons why they were audited. So I think there needs to be something in place.
That's one of the things we did tighten up the language in the RFP.
Turn on the mic, please.
It's on?
It's on. We're speaking to the mic.
That's one of the things we did do in the RFP, was to try to clean up all the areas that there was some gray through the last process.
Great.
As this evolves, last time we had a couple of board members picked for an appeal, but I think there was probably some involvement in pre-qualification and so forth. But should keep that separation there. They probably shouldn't be involved in the pre-qualification of eligibility. It's after the fact that, if you have a question and you've
we can ask it. Gustavo and I, as we go through these and look them over, anything questionable, we'll make a determination then. We'll call them and say, what is this, or we'll write questions down and present to the board so that the board, as a local entity or acting as a local entity, can make some decisions.
Yeah,
and we'll make our recommendations, of course.
I want to commend you for the work putting this together. This is good.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Brokin, did you need to bring your subject forward on its action? Because I know you guys have been waiting. Did you want to take that now, or are you okay with waiting? You're item number 15 on the action. Why don't let's get you out of the way. I know you.
Mr.
back there
Sansom,
waiting.
I want you to know, if I was running the meeting, you'd be the first one on the agenda. Wouldn't have to wait till almost 5 o'clock when the Lakers play at 5. You wouldn't have to wait.
Thank you. I appreciate that thought.
Yeah, we're going to jump over on an action item, which is adoption of resolution authorizing execution of certain documents related to the 2003 Certificates of Participation Refunding Programs on page 116.
Yes, I presented this last week. At that time, I told you we had a target level of net present value savings of $2 million. As of this afternoon, we were slightly below that target level. So although we still want the board's approval, we're not planning on going forward with the transaction until the market is more favorable and we are at our $2 million target level. I do have Danny Kim from Fulbright and Jaworski. They're our outside bond counsel. He works with Don Hunt, and he has a statement he'd like to read into the record.
Okay, come forward, please.
You can all join in unison.
What happened to the other gentleman that used to come before you?
He had another appointment that he had to be at, so he asked me to cover for him. Still very familiar with the IID's finances. And
Okay,
so,
I'm going to check every word you say.
Okay, again, this is just to state into the records the what's being presented before the board, and most importantly, clarifying exactly what sort of changes to the documents that can be made between now and the time that we close the transaction. The documents presented to you for approval authorize the issuance of the electric system refunding revenue bonds in an amount sufficient to refund all or a portion of the district's 2003 revenue certificates of participation 2003 electric system project, and the execution and delivery of a resolution, an escrow agreement, a bond purchase contract, a preliminary official statement, and a continuing disclosure certificate, all in substantially the forms presented at this meeting, with such additions thereto or changes therein as the officer executing such documents may require or approve. The board's approval of the bond purchase contract requires that the true interest cost on the bonds shall not exceed 4% per annum, and the underwriter's discount for the purchase of the bonds shall not exceed 0.7%, 70 basis points. The approval by the board of the preliminary official statement relating to the bonds authorizes the general manager or the chief financial officer of the district to certify to the underwriter on behalf of the district that the preliminary official statement was deemed final as of its date within the meaning of Rule 15C212 promulgated under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, except for the omission of certain pricing, rating, and related information as permitted by said rule. The board approval of the financing documents in substantially the forms presented is the same process followed by virtually all public agencies in California. Because rating information, actual interest rates, principal amounts by maturity, redemption provisions, and related matters are often not known until after the date of board approval or until the date of sale of the bonds, it is valid and legal for the board to approve the parameters of the bonds and the authorizing documents, and to delegate the approval of the final terms and details to district staff. This also allows for correcting typographical errors, non-material edits, and corrections of an update to information relating to the district and the electric system as necessary, contained in the preliminary official statement, etc. Once the bonds are sold, issued and delivered to the purchasers, our office will provide the final execution versions of the documents approved by the board, marked to show all the changes that were made to such documents following the approval of the board.
Okay. Mr. President, I move to approve the resolution and all documents related to the electric system refunding revenue bond series 2012A and certain other matters related thereto. 6, supplemental resolution, including approve the following agreements, preliminary official statement, and provide approval of an official statement, continuing disclosure certificate, escrow agreement, bond purchase contract, and release of the preliminary and final official statements.
Is there a second? I'll second it.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any discussion?
I just have one question. Are you satisfied that we've met the full disclosure requirements?
Based on our due diligence of reviewing the documents, yes.
Are there any other questions?
I just had one more for Greg. Greg, with all of these refinancing, how much money do you estimate you'd save the district since we started doing that?
Well, counting the water, it's probably close to $3 million, I think. But I can give you an exact number after we finish. We do this refunding. I can do it by issue.
I think it's even higher. So if I remember right.
Yeah, the numbers are still fluid. You really don't have us. Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? Please vote. Thank you. We'll jump back to general matters on water. Mr. Silva?
I don't have anything. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Silva? Okay, we'll move on to action again. Item number 11, approval of 2012 due.
Make a motion
payment.
to approve 2002 dues payment to Large Public Power Council.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any questions? Please vote. Thank you. We'll move on to water number 12, approval agreement with U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, reoperation, maintenance of the Mornings
Move to approve.
Second.
Any discussion?
I just wish that we would have received a cost plus on this contract, and particularly with our SCADA system too being used.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Please vote. Okay, move on to item number 13, approval of major work authorization.
Move to
rework
approve.
at Young.
Second.
Okay, any comments? Please vote. All right, number 14.
Move to approve.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second it with the recommendation that we go out to do an RFQ after the 3 years or whatever time it is.
All right, any questions on this?
Isn't it a 2-year extension, Greg?
After when we're completed with this one, do another RFQ.
Yeah, yes, we will.
Yeah.
Are we looking at?
Talked about that before.
Is this strictly for risk management, or is this as a broker?
This is for insurance consulting.
Okay.
Please vote. Okay, we already did 15. We'll go to 16, acknowledge receipt of the energy cost adjustment report for February 2012. Sandra?
Good afternoon, President and Directors. Before you is the update for the ECA for the month of February 2012. You're all pretty familiar with the calculation that is presented on the first couple of slides. So if there aren't any questions from board members, I'm going to go ahead and go to the end and show you what the overcollection figures are for the month of February and cumulatively. Are there any questions before I do that?
Okay, go ahead. Move ahead.
Okay. For the month of February 2012, the preliminary figure for the overcollection is $3.1 million. And for the year of 2012, that takes us to a cumulative figure of $6.1 million. When we add that to the carryover balance from 2011 of $38 million, that takes us to a cumulative year-to-date February figure of $44.1 million.
Okay, any questions?
What do you anticipate for the summer? Do you anticipate a reversal of this? Because we're going to prepare an adjustment, and then we'll have high usage, which if it does go to an under collection, well, we have money in reserve there though, don't we? Never mind.
Okay, any other
I'm
questions?
good.
Mr. Sanchez?
A little follow-up on that question. So in the summer, are we looking to reduce from the 3.50 cents to incorporate this 44 million into over summer prices? Because we still have the 100 million. I don't see why we couldn't use this 44 million over the summer.
Right. Well, projections currently are that with going out, Belen Valenzuela, interim resource planning manager, is working on going out and procuring renewable energy resources, and we expect those costs to start coming in May of 2012. So our current projections are that we would utilize this overcollection through the end of the year and come up a little short with a projected ECA of approximately 3.29, 3.30.
So there's an opportunity to reduce the rate again?
No. Actually, that would be slightly higher. We're currently at 3.24 a kilowatt hour, but those are current projections.
I think what would help us is if we knew how this overcollection is being realized. Is it trading? Is it just because of the low gas trend, or
right?
Fair weather, or
right. Well, I can let you. Oh, go ahead.
It looks like shoulder months right now, but you'll recall that it was true in the
that's what
tail end of summer too.
But I was trying to figure out if it was shoulder months or if this was going to hold. Yeah.
Right. We're with an ECA at 324. Right now, the higher costs do come into the summer. So in the shoulder and the early months, off-peak months, our costs will be lower.
If I can jump in just real quick too, we just made a gas purchase for the summer of 2012 at $2.70 some odd cents. So that's ridiculously low, and we're taking full advantage of that.
Take advantage of it.
Well, I understand that, but I thought that's what we have the 100 million for. I thought our beginning numbers to go up and down will be 100 million or less, and not necessarily the 44 million.
I think our resolution called for that to be saved for renewables in the next 4 years.
It's actually that if it goes the other way, we have to come to you for an expenditure. So not where we've got this net savings every reporting period, but we end up in a deficit.
Right. We would not start, according to the board resolution, we would not begin utilizing the rate stabilization funds until 2013 as necessary, not to exceed $25 million on an annual basis.
The rate stabilization fund, the rate stabilization fund is only capped at 100 million.
That's correct, currently.
But there's 144. So technically the 44 could be in question in a gray area, what we do with it.
I think the way that Mr. Brookings accounting for that is power supply. Is that right, Greg?
Yeah. Well, right now it's deferred revenue, and as we eat into that, it'll become power. Yes,
that's fine.
But it does include that half a cent that was in the same board resolution for.
I move to acknowledge receipt of the energy cost adjustment report for February 2012.
I'll second. Okay, any questions? Please vote. Okay, done.
Thank you.
I move to award the bid to Via Ford.
Is there a second?
I'm a Chevy man myself.
Please vote. Please vote. Okay, thank you. That's the end of the meeting.
Campbell, again, if I were president, you would have been taken first.
And I got you. The Lakers start at 5. I'm only 5 minutes late.
You're only 5 minutes late.